The futile facade. Chapter 13. It was hard to accept congratulations for the fifth task when she didn't remember most of it. Everyone in the castle seemed supremely confident that she would win the tournament outright. Hadn't she outperformed the challengers at every turn? Wasn't she looking forward to carrying the champion cup into the great hall at the end of year feast? Rigel tried to avoid the well-wishers, and when she couldn't, her friends ran interference. Rigel has to prepare for the final task. You can congratulate him when it's over. Under the weight of such eyes everywhere she went, she found her head often bowed and the breath heavy in her chest. When Dumbledore stopped by the Slytherin table with a formal invitation to his soiree, she grasped it with both hands. What is that? The flat tone told her Draco already knew. Rigel admitted to herself that she probably had forgotten to mention she was attending. Dumbledore invited me to the spring soiree this year. That is highly inappropriate, Pansy protested. He's your headmaster. He shouldn't be steering you politically. But it's okay for everyone else to, she said dryly. I'm not the only student who will be there. The Weasleys, Bones, and Longbottoms attend every year, Millicent allowed. But they are all light-aligned. Are you sure I'm not? There was general spluttering at that. You go to the Sow Gala every year, Draco said. And my parents' summer garden party. And I still will. I'm neutral, she said firmly. You're the Triwizard champion, Theo said with exasperation. Don't you know what it looks like, you going to this thing? Yes, I do. Theo gaped at her. So, you're throwing your support behind the light. You can't do that and claim neutrality. I knew there were some things about our platform you didn't agree with fully, but I thought. You thought I would support a platform I didn't believe in. One that actively works against the interests of people I love. Why? Ambition, he muttered. Thought you and Snape were birds of a feather. Rigel felt her gaze go cold. I don't think you understand Professor Snape or me at all. Pansy put a hand on hers and said, let's not argue over breakfast. Rigel, you can support whatever platform you like. Just be careful. Some of the light sect won't be able to look past your connections to the other side. She pulled her hand from beneath Pansy's and looked her square in the eye. They told me the same thing about your sect, and they were right. There are uncompromising people on both sides. She could still remember the way her schoolmates had stood very still and quiet the first time she encountered Silam Lestrange at a party function. I won't apologize for not being one of them. No one is asking you to apologize, Blaise said. He sounded tired. If you want people to understand you, you just have to explain yourself every once and a while. Rigel deflated. Now she wanted to apologize, but for what she wasn't sure. Her friends were never the ones she wanted to push away. Go and schmooze with the Gryffindors, then Draco said, dismissive pride in every syllable. Just don't forget who was with you at the start. I haven't. The start was further back than he imagined, though. Draco and Pansy and the others got to know her as Air Black, but before that Harriet Potter had a start of her own. It was to that beginning that she owed allegiance. It was for the Harrys of the world that she would go to Dumbledore's soiree. It sounded noble in her head, but she felt like a villain as she put on her dress robes at the end of the week. Draco and Theo ignored her when she said, see you later on her way out of the dorm. Blaise at least looked up from his periodical to nod. Pansy met her at the common room door. She looked down at Rigel's boots and said, no. A transfiguration that Pansy promised would wear off by the end of the day, 2 straightening charms for the wrinkles, and a smoothing spell for her hair later. Pansy put her wand away. I suppose you'll do, she said, attempting a smile. Thanks, Pan. I'm hopeless without you. Rigel shifted in her altered shoes. Also, I'm sorry for what I said the other day. You've been nothing but welcoming. I know it wasn't aimed at me. Pansy's smile was stronger, though, when she bid Rigel farewell. She resisted the urge to jog across the sweeping lawn in her dress robes, though something about the field of new spring grass made her want to run. Her heart lifted just a little at the thought. What would it be like to start running and never stop, never look back? Rigel squashed the urge ruthlessly until her pulse was calm and steady again. There was no room for regrets on her path. As she approached the group of students at the gate, she heard a voice say loudly, What is he doing here? The cluster shifted as people turned to look her way, and she saw all four Weasleys, Neville, and a number of other Gryffindors and Hufflepuffs she knew. Albright, wasn't it? Nice to see you again, she addressed the shorter boy who'd called her out. He scowled in her general direction without looking at her. Someone tell Black this is a light event. Get over yourself, Eric, Fred said lightly. George grinned in a less than friendly way. Yeah, Rigel is a cool Slytherin, Ron put in fiercely. He looked over at her uncertainly. What are you doing here, though? You never come to the soiree. I haven't been invited before. Your folks come every year, Neville said softly. Not that we aren't glad to have you now. Rigel doesn't do politics until he does. Ginny had her arm looped through the elbow of a girl with long, wispy blonde hair and a Ravenclaw tie. Have you met our neighbor, Luna? Luna, this is Rigel. The girl blinked large eyes at her and tilted her head in a way that bounced a radish-shaped earring against her cheek. Daddy did a segment about you in his newspaper, she said, her voice a little breathy. We both think it was terribly inhumane to set those Nargles on you in the fifth task. Rigel glanced at Ginny, whose sharp smile was vaguely threatening, and said, Thank you, Luna. It's nice to meet you. Meeting people is nice, isn't it? The portkey is warming up, Cedric Diggory called. They pressed into a tighter cluster around a long rope that had begun to glow faintly. Ron passed a loop into Rigel's hand and she gripped the rough length of it tightly in her fist. The glow became a flash and her guts tried to move through space without her before the rest of her body caught up like a rubber band snapping back into place. She landed hard on the ground, sprawled beside the others, and grasped dazedly at the first hand in her face. Diggory pulled her to her feet with a grin. Portkeys are endless fun, eh, Black? I wonder what wizard first taught the universe to chew people up and spit them back out. I'm sure the universe has always known how to do that. Some cheeky witch probably just condensed the experience down to a single instant. She straightened her robes just in time for Ron to slap her on the back and rumple them again. Good one, Rigel. It's always the witches. Come on, then, you remember the burrow, I hope. She shook her head as she took in the leaning tower of Weasley presiding over an entire field of festivities. Enormous white pavilions dominated the yard, their panels secured by colored ribbons to golden poles. Food sprawled in piles on every surface and refreshments bubbled out of fountains interspersed between the pavilions. Each tent was guarded by an ice sculpture as big as a man, which ranged from lions, badgers, and ravens to phoenixes, dragons, and sphinxes. I think I'd remember if you lived at the circus, Ron. Mum's really outdone herself this year, he agreed. The ice animals were probably Dumbledore's doing, though. You'll notice there aren't any snakes, Albright hissed from behind them. She eyed him as he passed. Could have fooled me. Don't let him get to you, Ron advised. The Albrights are a bunch of self-righteous types. Twats, you mean? Ginny bumped her other arm companionably. Rigel knows well enough how to handle those, got a whole house full of them, don't you? I hope you're referring to my schoolhouse and not my family. Ginny affected an alarmed look. Would I insult your beloved Harriet? You have repeatedly done so to her face. That's how I show affection. That explains so much, little sis. Fed pounced on the girl like an oversized cat. She yelled fiercely but was unable to escape the hair-mussing that followed. All this time we thought you hated us, when really you were crying out for affection. George encapsulated the girl and his twin in a rather violent embrace. I yield, Ginny spluttered from the eye of the hurricane. I take it back. Get off me. Her words only encouraged the twins, until Ron said mildly, Mum will be torched if Gin's dress robes are wrinkled. Fred and George sprang back like guilty children. George coughed a quick straightening charm under his breath as Fred looked around for any sign of Molly bearing down on them. There was a Weasley headed their way, but it was Bill. Oh, the party is over here, you lot. Bill eyed his younger siblings with wry amusement. Your straightening charm needs work, George. No straightening charm in the world can bend Gin, Fred said with a sly smile. Gin elbowed him in the gut and stomped on a foot for good measure. Anything else you'd like to say in polite company? Just a general warning to all against little sisters, he muttered through a grimace. It's a special bond you have, Luna said suddenly. I used to pretend you were my older brothers, too, when Ginny let me play here. The Weasleys exchanged uncomfortable glances, and Rigel marveled at the Ravenclaw's ability to disarm all 5 of them simultaneously. Well, I came to wrangle the 4 of you before you scattered to the winds, Bill said when the awkward moment had passed. George nodded seriously. The General wants a word. You guessed it. Better go make our reports, then. Rigel, want to say hi to our mum. Not if you're looking for a human shield. Puppy, would we admit it if we were? Please, Rigel, Ron wheedled. She's much nicer to us around strangers. Ginny tossed her hair and struck her brothers with a scathing glance. Cowards, all of you. Come, Luna. She strode toward the house, the dainty Ravenclaw on her arm. Witches. Ron shook his head like a dog shedding water. He peered at Rigel hopefully. Sure you don't want to come with? She looked over at Neville, who was hovering uncertainly. The pale boy shrugged his shoulders. If you come with me, you'll have to say hi to Gran. Are you all afraid of your female relatives? You aren't. Ron seemed genuinely bewildered. Course he is. Fred sounded sure. Have you forgot he's literally related to Bellatrix Lestrange? Lady Malfoy, too, George said, ticking off his fingers. Plus Andromeda Tonks, Nymphadora, don't ever call me that again or I'll eat your bollocks Tonks, and the late but still horrifying in rumor Wahlburger Black. A sudden chill passed a shudder between them. You forgot Aunt Lily, Rigel pointed out. Lady Potter. But she's so nice, Neville protested. Rigel laughed. Nice doesn't eat the dark arts for breakfast. Aunt Lily is terrifying. There was a pause as the boys considered this. Maybe we should just stay here and not talk to anyone. Come off it, Ron. Fred shook his head. George nodded. It'll hurt worse if they have to hunt us down. To our doom, then. Rigel suggested lightly. Bill raised a hand to his heart. Your sacrifice won't be forgotten. Where will you be, then? Avoiding Mum, obviously. Bill slunk in the opposite direction, shoulders slouched and chin tucked as though his mother wouldn't be able to pick his distinctive shade of hair out of a crowd in Millyskens. That turncoat. I bet Mum never even wanted a word with us. Ron looked after his older brother with disgust. Where's the top cover? The brotherly loyalty. He just wanted to throw us in her path as a distraction. Still, I should probably pay my respects to the hostess, Rigel said, somewhat apologetically. Ron groaned. And the first thing she'll say is, where's Ron? You can do this, Rigel assured him with a bracing pat on the shoulder. Easy for you to say. You faced down a dragon, Rigel. Same basic principles, she offered weakly. Sure, just keep your wand at the ready. Apply fire free liberally. And don't ever turn your back on it. Fred and George dissolved into guffaws, but Neville straightened, a serious glint in his eyes. There's no other choice, is there? Rigel grinned. Exactly, Neville. When you realize the hard way is the only path forward, hesitation and fear become meaningless. Meaningless, he repeated, unconvinced. You'll still feel the curdling in your stomach, but it can't stop your feet if you really want them to move. She took a large step toward the party in the distance. You try. With a wry smile, he mirrored her movement. Fred and George hollered a war cry and made running leaps, and even Ron took an exaggerated stride. All solemnity dissolved, they made an ungainly series of leaps and jumps toward the square-pointed tents. As they squeezed between two pavilions, Fred and George traded off in single-file leaps over one another, finally spilling in a tumble of limbs and grins at their mother's feet. Oh, for Godric's sake, boys. Could you not last 5 minutes without working each other into a state of hysterical, Rigel? How good to see you, dear. What on earth are they feeding you up at that school? Come, get a plate, the pork hash is just come out. Thank you so much for having me, Mrs. Weasley, she said, bowing at the waist. So polite. Molly sighed and shifted narrowed eyes toward her brood. Ginny held up her hands at once. Now, Mum. Remember, Rigel likes me rude. The fiery-haired woman looked between Rigel and her daughter with exasperation, but turned her attention to Ron instead. Grown again, have you? Ron looked down at his pant leg, which came an inch or two above his ankle, and grimaced. Bill was looking for you, he lied. I saw him ducking me earlier. Molly clucked her tongue. Come to Dumbledore's soiree looking like a pirate, he should be afraid. Speaking of which. Her eyes cut to Neville, where they thought. Madame Longbottom is by the ice punch. Neville slumped. Probably looking to find something wrong with it. I dare her to try. Molly lifted her chin. Rigel, you ought to say hello as well. She personally requested your presence this year. That was news to Rigel. She turned curious eyes on Neville, who shrugged. Not like she explains herself to me, the boy said. The twins gave her wide-eyed look of betrayal as she bowed again to excuse herself. Neville blew out a breath when they were out of earshot. I like Ron's family, but in pieces. Their cumulative presence is more than the sum of their parts, she agreed. Did you really not know your Gran asked Dumbledore to invite me? The Gryffindor slid a nervous glance her way. She's asked me about you. Nothing personal, political stances and views, mostly. I think she's hoping you'll come over to our side. Rigel frowned. I've always agreed with light politics. No one has to convince me. Neville shot her a surprised look. Thought you wanted to stay neutral. I thought I did, too. She took a long breath. I tried to. Used to think if I didn't bother anyone, didn't draw attention to myself, the world would leave me to my cauldrons. Now I find myself on the opposite side from what I would have chosen, simply because I didn't choose until it was too late. I don't think it's ever too late, Neville said slowly. She smiled thinly. I hope you're right. They approached a towering fountain of pale blue punch that fell from the upper tiers in sparkling crystals like snow. Augusta Longbottom, formidably attired in stiff brocade with a stuffed vulture in pride of place on her wide-brimmed hat, held a wide-lipped glass before her eyes. Am I meant to wait until the drink melts or lap at it like a child with an ice cone? Alice Longbottom held her own glass beneath the gentle snowfall and watched the blue crystals collect with a smile. I think it's fun. Fun. Good. That's why we gather the most prominent forces for the light here in the wilds of Ottery St. Catchpole each year. For fun. Neville. Frank Longbottom caught sight of his son cutting through the crowd and raised a hand to wave. Alice whirled and a smile beamed across the distance. Neville shot Rigel an embarrassed look, but strode forward more quickly to embrace his parents nonetheless. Hi, Mum. Dad. Sweetums, we've missed you. How is your second term going? Made much progress on that potions mark? Augusta asked sharply. Neville's ears turned red. A little, grandmother. Madame Longbottom appraised him sternly for a long moment, then set her drink on the rim of the fountain and opened her arms. Well, come greet me properly, eh? Neville ducked his head to hide a grin and embraced the old woman gently. That's enough of that. Augusta reclaimed the delicate glass and prodded Neville upright. Going to introduce us to your friend? We've met before, Madame Longbottom, Rigel said, stepping closer when the family created space in their midst. At least, Sirius claimed they had. She had no memory of it, but they'd apparently been taken to Dumbledore's soiree as small children until they were too old to be carried in their mother's arms. I doubt you recall it, young man. You introduced me to your invisible griffin who ate whole sticks of butter. Rigel closed her eyes in embarrassment for Archie. Finny ate raisins, too, she said with a wry smile. I believe it was you who ate the raisins, Black. She bowed with a flourish. Raisin eater and griffin tamer at your service, Madame Longbottom. Alice laughed. How like Sirius you are. Is he here today? Probably, but I haven't seen him yet, she admitted. Making the rounds before greeting your own family. Augusta did not look impressed. Rigel came through on the portkey with us, Neville put in on her behalf. He went to pay respects to Mrs. Weasley first, and she directed him to speak with you, Grandma. As well she should. Do you know why you are here, Black? It would be foolish to guess if you are about to tell me, she said carefully. You are here to make an account of yourself to the light. Mother, please. Frank turned a long-suffering face her direction. He's 14. Do you suppose the dark cares how old he is? Augusta drew herself up to full height and glared down the slope of her nose. Black, you are the Triwizard champion. The last task decides. Don't interrupt. It is plain to all watching that you are the wizard who will emerge victorious. What is not plain is which side you will stand with when that happens. Rigel waited a moment to be sure Augusta was finished speaking. I stand with my family, as always. Well said, Frank muttered. I will be having words with Lord Black as well today, Augusta declared. Left us in quite the lurch, turning neutral all of a sudden. I understand he did it to keep a closer eye on you as you gamble about dark society with your school friends. Rigel could not refute that, so she inclined her head. I admit I wrote you off when you were sorted. Despite good influences, I assumed the black genes had reasserted themselves. Mother. Frank winced. However, she said with a sharp jerk of her chin. My grandson tells me otherwise. Now I would like to hear it from you. Have you reconsidered your allegiances? I have never declared them, she said. You did indeed, if not word. Rigel held her chin steady. By attending my friend's birthday party, you mean? By accepting blood ties to the Malfoys. A life debt is sacred, mother. I am very sorry, Black, Frank said firmly. I take no offense. I have learned that to be in the public eye is to face scrutiny for private relationships. I am a friend to the Malfoys. I am also a friend to the Potters, the Weasleys, and, if it pleases you, the Longbottoms. She sent a small smile to Neville, who returned it uncertainly. I keep diverse company, and part of that is the nature of the house I was sorted into, and part of it is my own upbringing and preference. Those relationships don't dictate my politics, madam. I support the light. There, she had declared it. And what does that mean to you? Augusta pushed. Good over evil. Truth against villainy. She wrinkled her nose. Light politics, madam, not fairy tales. It means I support the rights of Muggleborns and half-bloods to equal protection under the law in all aspects of society. I believe in the humane treatment of all magical creatures and in fair dealings with our fellow magical beings. I oppose discrimination on the basis of blood or gender or magical ability. I oppose the doctrine of magic is might. I oppose political structures that benefit the few at the expense of the many. I oppose, in general, the concept of lineage as an argument for social superiority at all, and that includes the title I hold as heir to the House of Black. Most of all, I oppose any system which puts children into moral or social categories before they learn how to hold a wand straight. The Longbottoms, 2-1, stared at her, until Augusta said, It seems I was mistaken, then. I might have guessed, of course, your father declared his path late in life as well. Mind you don't do something so dramatic as running away on a flying motor car. I'll strive to refrain from such a scene, she said dryly. Do. Mother. Do what? Sirius stole up behind her and clapped a hand down on Rigel's shoulder. Frank, Alice, it's been a while. And young Neville, you are the spitting image of Frank in school, if you don't mind me saying. Madam Longbottom, but no, you haven't aged a day. Be honest, have you phoenixes in your ancestry? He eyed the vulture on her hat with a devilish glint. Augusta sneered. Only the blacks have what it takes to conceive of such unnatural things. Well, that is the Black family motto, whatever it takes to conceive. Rigel groaned. Dad, gross. Can we change that or something? I'm afraid you need a supermajority of blacks to change the motto, and Reddy won't be budged. She lifted an eyebrow. I bet I could get Aunt Sissy on my side. She doesn't count. You'll have to produce sons until you outnumber us. Sirius seemed to relish the horrified look on her face as he added, Why do you think the motto never changes? It's a catch-22. You haven't read that book. Lily explained it to me ad nauseam. Where is Aunt Lily? Rigel shot back. I can't imagine she let you off your leash so soon. I outwitted her. Unlikely. You recruited Uncle James to distract her, right? He barked out a laugh. Close. I charmed Addie's hair to look like tiny snakes and ran away while she was figuring out how to fix it. Rigel made a show of checking her pocket watch. So you've got, what, 60 seconds until she bears down on you with the wrath of nesting dragon. You'd know more about dragons than me, Sirius said, inspecting his fingernails unconcernedly. I hope you at least planted a false trail. I mentioned hours ago how eager I was to catch up with Gideon and Fabian. She nodded in approval. I'm impressed, Dad. The plan almost certainly hinged on her ally, Remus, being home after the moon, but still. You don't usually think it through that far. Lately, the future has weighed on me a bit. What is my legacy? What do I strive for? Why, I even have a vague inkling as to what I'll eat for dinner tonight. He sighed. Must be getting old. Not as old as Augusta, mind you, but... Enough. You blacks are nothing if not tiresome. Augusta poured her glass of blue snow back into the fountain and set the empty container pointedly on its rim. If you wish to disarm us, words are not enough. No amount of antics will make us forget who you call kin. I need deeds, Sirius, and your slide backwards into neutrality is not reassuring to witness. Sirius let the ready smile fall from his face. Can't choose our kin, madam. You can choose the light. I have, he said quietly. My public stance doesn't change that. You cannot be so naive. The venerable woman fairly shook with the vehemence with which she spoke. Public perception is everything to this campaign. All the world watches as the Black Heir proves the concept of blood purity and his father steps firmly back from his progressive platforms. Next thing I hear you're to organize a joint charity venture with Lucius Malfoy. Do you want Riddle to cash in every chip he's wagered for the past decade? Will you be satisfied when? That will do, mother. Frank's mouth had set into an unhappy line. I'm sure you've given our friends plenty to think about. The time for thinking is almost over. Only actions matter now. Augusta Longbottom drew her brocade overskirt back from her feet and left their company. Frank started to apologize, but Sirius held up a hand. She's right to be frustrated. I have made things difficult. You did it for me, Rigel said, nudging him gently. Guilty waves lapped at her heart. Dad, you know, I never planned to make friends in Slytherin. It just happened. And then, I certainly never thought you'd have to sacrifice anything over it. When Sirius declared neutral, it hadn't made the ruse any easier, but there had been a certain easing in tension between him and Archie. Perhaps it hadn't been worth it. Don't be such a martyr in Gryffindor, Sirius said, a bit of his usual cheer threading into his tone. I've made my choices and my peace with them. I would do anything for Neville, Alice said suddenly. She curled a protective hand around her son's arm. I'd walk any path, if it led to his happiness. Augusta is set in her ways like most of the old guard, but we understand you, Sirius, and the complexities of the situation. Please don't think you've lost any friends over a label. Sirius' smile was one she'd never seen before, fragile and uncertain, like it was built on air. Thank you, Alice. Frank. Sorry to have spoiled the mood. Frank waved his apology away. The soiree is always more politics than party. We've come to expect a few dramatic moments, wouldn't be worth getting dressed up if no one made shocking declarations or mortally offended an Albright. Now, there's a goal I can get behind, Sirius said, making a show of looking around. Where is old Ulrich Albright? Probably inspecting the alloy ratios in the flateware, Alice said with a sly grin. As her eyes glinted with mischief, Rigel could suddenly see how she and Lily became friends. Want to watch your old man bully an even older man? Sirius looked hopeful, but Rigel shook her head. Riveting as that would be, I'm going to find James and Lily. As his eyes flew wide in pronounced fear, she smiled. I won't tell Lily I've seen you. This is why you're my favorite son. Where are you hiding the others, anyway? Somewhere safe, in case you step out of line. Neville coughed to cover a sudden laugh, and Sirius sent him a wicked grin. Glad you were born light, eh kid? More and more, Lord Black, Neville muttered into his collar. Rigel wandered through the various tents, looking for her mother's distinctive coloring. She finally found her near the apparition point at the outskirts of the party, glaring up at two men with matching cinnamon manes. Swear we haven't seen him, one of the men was saying, all the earnestness of a veteran player in his voice. Looking for Sirius, Aunt Lily. Rigel called. Lily spun, pure predation in her eyes as she clutched Addie's snake-free head to her chest. "Archie! Where is the wretch?" "Gone to annoy Aldermaster Albright," she said. "He feels no repentance and will likely avoid you for the rest of the party." One of Lily's victims edged away with a wide grin that revealed his genetic connection to Fred and George. "You see, Lily, might as well enjoy the soiree now. And punish Sirius at your leisure later," his brother finished. Lily blew a lock of hair back from her face and readjusted Addie in her arms. "I suppose it's foolish to try tracking him all over Molly's garden. Well then. If that's settled." The men executed a tactical attack in the opposite direction, and Lily scowled after them. "Those two?" She fumbled a moment as Addie made to dive from her arms. "Ah, yes, darling, you can go to Archie." Rigel caught the free-diving toddler with an alarmed lurch in her stomach. "Hi, Addie," she said, a bit breathless as her sister gazed up at her with wide eyes. "Hoi," Addie said, batting her hand against Rigel's mouth insistently. Rigel craned her neck away from the sticky appendage. "No, Addie, it's Archie." "Archie." "Hoi!" Addie shouted, her voice a little bursting crack. Lily smiled at her apologetically. "You really do look very alike, Archie." She sighed. "I know. Where's Uncle James?" "I sent him to hunt down Sirius in case Fabian and Gideon were decoys." "They're probably having drinks together right now," Rigel surmised. Dink. Addie opened and closed her mouth like a fish out of water. "You know that one, huh?" She grinned down at the copper-headed toddler. "Want to see a drink fountain that makes blue snow?" Dink. With solemn approval from the Godler, Rigel led the way. As they wove through ribbon-wrapped tent poles, Lily said quietly, "How are you doing, Archie?" "We've heard disturbing things about the fifth task." It was disturbing, she agreed, her face twisting. Addie smacked her clenched jaw and surprised a smile out of her. "Ow, Addie. Oh. Ouch. Ouch. I think she's making fun of me." "This one is going to have some strange ideas about social norms," Lily said ruefully. She caught Rigel's eyes. "You didn't answer my question." "I'm doing as well as can be expected," she said, aware that it was not entirely reassuring. I'm tired, Aunt Lily." "Sirius has been beside himself with worry," Lily told her, a careful lack of reproof in her voice. "I think it's harder for him to hear about the tasks than it would be to witness them for himself." She winced. "I didn't mean to make it harder on you all." She caught Addie's hand before it could smack her in the lip again and examined the tiny fingernails. Without looking at Lily, she added, "I feel like a different person in these tasks. Part of me doesn't want you to see that." Lily wrapped her in a hug that gracefully encompassed Addie, too. "We would never think differently of you, Archie. These tasks are dangerous. Do what you must to survive with your mind and body intact. I understand how your decisions might be clearer when you don't have to worry what we'll think. I just want you to know that it won't matter to us either way. We just want you home." Rigel bit back the moisture in her eyes with ruthless willpower. "I love you," she whispered. "I don't say it enough." "We know, sweetheart." Lily held her until Addie squealed a protest at being squished between them. She took a deep breath to clear the urge to break into shuddering sobs from her lungs. When she thought she could speak without croaking, she said, "It's fine if you all want to come to the last task. It's only right that you should be there at the end." It was only one more task. The excitement of the tournament finale and their worry for Archie would likely forestall any questions her performance stirred. The Longbottoms had wandered elsewhere, but there were a pair of familiar wizards inspecting the extravagant fountain when they approached. "Lady Potter." The lioness herself appears. Raoul Golden Tower swept a courtly bow, his husband a beat behind him. "Lords Golden Tower." Lily curtsied with the flair of a dancer. "I'm sure I don't have to remind you that I was not a Gryffindor." "And yet, you are everything the fair house was built to emulate," Gareth declared. "Where is James? We've been meaning to duel him for your hand." "As I am Lord Potter's champion, you'd be dueling me, I'm afraid," Lily said with a grin. "Damned clever of him, making the task insurmountable," Raoul mused. "Have you met my nephew, Archie?" "At the Yule Ball, we had the pleasure," Raoul confirmed. "Mr. Black, how are you holding up?" She shrugged, bouncing Addy into giggles in the process. Well enough, Lord Golden Tower. The finish line is fast approaching. And you seem poised to cross it first, Raoul said frankly. His partner snorted into his glass of ice punch. It's not favoritism, Gary, only cold truth. I don't see the other two overtaking you in the last task. Do you know what the final task is? Lily asked, unmasked concern in her gaze. It's no secret, Raoul confirmed. They've begun growing the maze already. Had they? That was news to Rigel, but then, she wasn't the most plugged into the happenings at Hogwarts. A maze. That seems suspiciously wholesome after the last few. Gareth gave a dark chuckle. I wouldn't trust it. What do you think, Mr. Black? Raoul's dark eyes glinted like whetstones. Rigel grimaced. I've no doubt in the organizers' ability to overwhelm us with their creativity. Keep that cynicism, boy. In the position you now hold, it'll serve you well, Raoul suggested. Lily looked at her with significantly less approval. She knew it was not something Archie would have said, at least, not the Archie their family knew. Gareth, perhaps sensing the solemn moment, changed the subject abruptly. I'll be looking forward to Miss Potter's coursework when it comes in again this summer. After our last meeting, I read a few of her essays, damned insightful, if I do say so myself. You have, repeatedly Raoul put in dryly. Some of Lily's worry for Archie was swept away by surprise. The correspondence course, you mean? Is she still doing that? You didn't know. I remember her asking for the tuition the first year, but then, I suppose I forgot. She glanced at Addy almost guiltily. Harry uses her earnings from brewing to pay for the courses, she explained quietly. She sells potions. At, what, 14? Gareth shook his head in amazement. Well, that explains the rigor of her assignments in that category. Who does she contract with? Raoul asked. A couple of apothecaries in Diagon Alley, she said carefully. Horace Burke has her on the hook for blood replenishers and a few others, as well. Burke. The devil never mentioned anything so interesting. Raoul seemed affronted at having been left in the dark on gossip of any kind. I'm sure Harry appreciates his discretion, she murmured. And I'm sure it was more self-serving than not. There's some who wouldn't trust a 14-year-old's brews, no matter her brilliance, Raoul said shrewdly. She must have been brewing younger than that, if she's been paying her tuition for 2 years with it, Gareth added. His confusion was polite, but marked. Lily looked uncomfortably confused as well. Harry's always been practically minded, she said, trying to sound upbeat. Combine that with Aunt Lily's brains, Uncle James' entrepreneurial instincts, Remus' organizational abilities, and serious bad influence, and... The adults laughed. Quite the pair of heirs you lot raised, Raoul complained. Leave something of the world for the rest of ours, won't you? How is Gilman? Raoul raised a hand to his lips and an ear-splitting whistle rang out. He gazed about imperiously, and Rigel supposed it must be nice occasionally to be head and shoulders above the crowd. Ah. Here he comes. He's not a dog, Raoul, Gareth muttered. You're the one who objected to the leash charm. This is equally demeaning. A curly-haired 3- or 4-year-old shot around the fountain and nearly barreled into Raoul's feet. Dad. Pa. I found you. That you did, sport. Raoul hefted the child onto one shoulder and grinned proudly. This here's my heir, Gilman. Gilman, say hello to Lady Lillian Potter, Miss Adriana Potter, and Mr. Archirus Black. At the sound of Archie's name, the boy's jaw dropped. Are you lying, Dad? He had the rounded speech of a boy who was not confident in his RS yet. Gareth snorted, but Raoul ignored him. Ask him yourself. Gilman stared down at her with something approaching awe and whispered, "Or you really Archirus Black?" She secured Addy to her hip and gave a proper bow. At your service, Gilman. Did you get my note? The boy nodded, eyes wide. The moment was broken by Addy's open hand slapping against Rigel's cheek with a resounding smack. She flinched. Ouch, Addy. Addy giggled, and so did Gilman. Rigel smiled ruefully. Fiercer than a dragon, this one. Or you scored of dragons? I am. Gilman blurted. She nodded. Very scared. Dragons are super dangerous and they do not like wizards. But you fought one. I was scared the whole time, she said seriously. Oh. That's okay. Papa says everybody gets scored. He's right. And he says even Gryffindors do. That's true as well. And he says Daddy is the scoriest of all. She hid a smile as Raoul's ears turned pink. I can't speak to that one, but your papa sounds very wise. Oh. I like you. I like you, too. Raoul cleared his throat. All right, little parrot. Where's your minder? Aunt Bewie is with Aunt Theet. Well, we can't trust those two together for long, can we? Better go find them, Sprout. Gilman laughed into his fist as he scampered away. Lily gazed after him with a wistful smile. They grow so fast. Faster, if they have golden tower genes, Gareth said, pointedly glancing at Raoul's long legs. We can't all be part giant. She turned at the sound of James' voice, and took in the sight of him. Her father clasped hands with Raoul and took a clap on the back from Gareth before tossing a grin her way. All right there, Arch. All right, Uncle James. Did you find Sirius? Lily asked pointedly. James swept his immediate surroundings for escape almost automatically before manfully clearing his throat and saying, Nope. Aren't you paid to find people, Uncle James? Rigel affected polite confusion. Not anymore, he said defensively. Now I'm paid to manage the people who find people. Like my wayward apprentice. Moody, as grizzled in person as he was in rumor, stalked into their midst with all the social grace of a hungry tiger. He wore robes that were not technically a garb, but mimicked it perfectly in cut and style. She's supposed to be running perimeter. As this is not an official ministry event, I am not technically responsible for its security, James said weakly. It's Dumbledore's soiree, Raoul said, rolling his neck unconcernedly. You'd be mad to try and crash it. Dark wizards are not known for their rational, goal-oriented approaches. Moody glared around the loose circle with his piercing blue eyes as though one of them might be a dark wizard in disguise. The sharp gaze landed on Rigel. You? Yes, sir. The response came without conscious fashioning. Good lesson you taught my recruits in the fourth task. I didn't know I wasn't supposed to fight them. Like I say, good lesson for them. Constant vigilance. He shouted more than said it, and James winced. If we see Tonks, we'll point her your way, James assured the olderer. Moody would not be hurried along. His eyes still fixed on Rigel, he said slowly, You're a damned good duelist, Black. Your daddy didn't teach you all those fancy moves. Uncle Remus taught me dueling, actually. Bull. Remus did tutor him this summer, Lily confirmed. Sirius and I did, too. He was progressing well. What I saw was more than progressing, closer to professional. Moody did not hide his annoyance with that fact. So what's this nonsense I hear from Dawlish about healing? Rigel blinked. As I told her, Dawlish, I won't be joining the Iroquois. James whipped his head around in surprise, and she smiled reassuringly around Addie's hair. I intend to become a healer. Give it up. Moody jerked his head in a dismissive toss. I saw the way you dealt with Owens. You don't like innocents being hurt. She dropped her eyes to Addie's sweet face, which was scrunched in a yawn. That's why I want to heal people, she explained patiently as the toddler nestled into her shoulder. Bah. Help me bring dark wizards to task, unless you sympathize with them. That's enough, Moody. Archie's always wanted to be a healer. James put a hand on her shoulder firmly. I think it's noble. It's a bloody waste, the senior muttered. Now, more than ever, we need people in the fight. Let's not talk shop, James tried. Nonsense. People ought to know their cozy peace has an expiration date. The Lord's Golden Tower exchanged frowns, and Gareth said slowly, Moody, we all know it's your job to prepare for worst-case scenarios. What's so different about these recent attacks that sets them apart from dozens of other isolated events over the past few decades? Moody inflated his chest like an overgrown bird. Everything. They are organized. They are connected. There's messaging. Some of that rational, goal-orientedness, you mean? Raoul drawled. Laugh while you can, Moody groused. I've got sources from all the bad places that say there's something worse come into the shadows of late. Targeting traditionally violent groups. Recruiting. Orchestrating. And you think it's a coincidence extreme bigotry is being aired for all the world to see? No, I don't think so. Rigel wondered if one of his sources was her anonymous tip. She wouldn't be surprised to hear that Bill Weasley was funneling information to the light, too. He had invaluable access to the underworld of the alleys, for all that the thief's code would stop him short of giving specific names. I think you're right, Moody, she offered, shifting a dozing Addie carefully to her other arm and shaking out the one that had gone numb. It's not a coincidence. Certainly, the tournament has emboldened a few fringe groups, but that doesn't imply a direct connection between the two. James sounded as though he'd had this argument with his old mentor before. There was a direct connection, Riddle, in two horrifying manifestations, but she couldn't say as much. There's Andromeda, Lily said suddenly. Perhaps she knows where Nymphadora has gone. Moody's head swiveled, a hound after a scent. Doubtfully, he grumbled, if Andromeda had dragged her spawn here, she wouldn't be late. Only one way to be sure, Lily cajoled. With a final, hard look around the circle, Moody went to hound Andromeda Tonks. Old Moody only has one track, Raoul said. James nodded, though a frown pinched his brow. He's been wrong before, but more often, he's right. When your hypothesis is dark wizards are evil, it's hard to be wrong. Rigel didn't recognize the forceful voice, but she caught a grimace on both her parents' faces before they hid them behind polite smiles. Ulrich, impeccable timing, as usual, Raoul said, face blank. I was loath to interrupt such a serious conversation, the man said, striding into their midst with his shoulders rolled back and chin tilted up. And yet James muttered. The newcomer did not appear to hear him. He was a head shorter than the other lords, and even Rigel had an inch or two advantage, but he made up for it in solid stockiness. Ash blonde hair bristled thickly on his round head and curled in a neat beard from broad cheekbones. Raoul, Gary Potters. And. He peered at Rigel for a moment before it clicked. Ah. Black. Your father mentioned you were about while he was making a nuisance of himself earlier. That's his general equilibrium, she said with a small smile. Pleased to meet you, Aldermaster Albright. Your heir and I are classmates, of a sort. He's mentioned no such thing, Albright said with narrowed eyes. Aren't you a fourth year? I'm in Dumbledore's alchemy class, she explained. We don't have class together, but as we are the only two students. Alchemy is a light art. Rigel held back a sigh. She could see where Eric Albright had absorbed his rather skewed opinions. It was designed initially around light runes, and the transition to the neutral art we study today is fascinating, Lily said forcefully. Did you know it was a Lady Black in the 12th century who first applied arithmancy to the calculation of material coefficients? Well, of course you did. She laughed and toasted Ulrich Albright with a glass of blue snow. You are the Aldermaster of the Alchemy Guild. Indeed. Ulrich wrinkled his short nose, but didn't argue further. And your heiress, Potters. I hear she's started down the guild route herself. Malcolm never shuts up about her, he added with a slight sneer. Harry is doing well, thank you for asking, James said through stiff lips. Not as well as Thing 1, though, eh? Ulrich pinned her with storm grey eyes. Pure blood champion. It's thanks to you we've called in every political favor on our books this session. Now, Ulrich, Raoul protested. He knows it, I'm sure, Albright drawled. Slytherin, isn't he? Baptized in politics from the cradle. I was once baptized in the dark arts by our family house elf, Rigel said blandly. James snorted before he caught himself in a cough. Ah, that house elf was mad, Archie. Still, I was in a cradle, she said earnestly. The Golden Towers laughed, but Albright's disapproving smile never faltered. You're aware as well, I suppose, that if you win, public support will swing irreparably in favor of the SOW party and they'll pass the biggest packet of legislation since the 1989 split. Here, now, James began, fierce protectiveness on his face. Rigel frowned. It's all right, Uncle James. She met Albright's gaze. I am aware of that, Aldermaster Albright. I wasn't when I started this tournament, but it makes little difference what my intentions were. I'll be judged by the results. As are we all, Gareth said with a pointed stare at Albright. The Aldermaster seemed immune to peer censure. What will you do about it, then? She pretended to misunderstand. I'm not sure what I can do at this stage beyond surviving the last task. Albright let out a hollow laugh. Certainly don't die. Last thing we need is a pure-blood martyr. A second-place finish wouldn't hurt, though, particularly if that Owens boy comes first. Are you suggesting my nephew throw an international tournament? James had an error's warning in his voice. Albright shrugged. Not suggesting anything. Just noting the results of a hypothetical outcome out loud. Rigel kept her face blank against the grimace that wanted to form. Of course, the one thing likely to help combat the legislation was the one thing the unbreakable vow prevented her from doing. Is there no way to block the legislation regardless of public sentiment? The Aldermaster snorted and cut his eyes challengingly to Lord Golden Tower. Well, Raoul. You're the resident expert on the Wisdom Gamma. Raoul rolled a shoulder uncomfortably. We're focused on swaying the neutral members with a preponderance of seats. Unfortunately, the most principled of the neutral sect see it as their duty to vote in accordance with the electorate's wishes. On this highly publicized issue, it means public favor counts more than it might for more obscure legislation. She ran the issue through her mind, the gears shifting and realigning with uncomfortable friction. Her free hand came up to cradle the back of Addie's head, as though she could shield her little sister from the dark turn of her thoughts. I could become the villain, she said slowly. The adults around her went still. She looked at them uncertainly. I could do something terrible. Be caught in a scandal, or perform some barely legal dark magic in the last task. If people were ashamed to support me, perhaps it would extend some unpopularity to the legislation I've become the symbol for. There was silence for a moment. Lily and James stared at her in mild horror, but she could see their minds racing. Would it work? Would it be worth it? Albright was the first to speak. It's too late for that. You underestimate your base if you think they wouldn't rather deny your deeds than admit their mistake in believing in you. She winced. That was perhaps the most cynical thing she'd ever heard. James nodded, his face set in harsh lines. You're better off untarnished, Archie. It sounds callous, but if the legislation goes through, we may need your pure-blood credentials to soften the impact. Raoul made a noise of unhappy agreement. You make a good role model right now. What you do, other purebloods and even half-bloods may emulate. Don't throw that away. Rigel wasn't sure if she should feel relief or frustration. On the one hand, she didn't want to bring shame to Archie's good name. On the other, she didn't relish the idea of playing the moderate pureblood for social politics. It seems I have found the gloomiest group in the garden. Dumbledore smiled genially as the circle opened for him. Don't tell me you aren't enjoying your first soiree, Mr. Black, however will I convince you to come back next year? She hitched her mouth up for the older wizard's benefit. On the contrary, sir. It's just the diversion I needed. He fixed her with a penetrating stare. While I do believe you're in need of an escape, dear child, my suspicious old brain doubts you have found any relief from the pressures of the tournament here. Dumbledore shifted his gaze to the others in the circle, who, one by one, dropped or averted theirs. Rigel hid a real smile. We were just discussing the merits and pitfalls of popularity, Headmaster. Nothing too serious. Ah. Well, as someone who has experienced both unaccountable popularity and incontestable villainization, I would say public opinion is rather overrated. His eyes twinkled and he smiled with the serenity of a man who had long risen above the cares of his fellows. My advice, for whatever small measure of the human experience it represents, is to seek truth, be faithful to your principles, do the best you can in every situation, and learn from your mistakes while forgiving others theirs. She felt her heart sink a little. And should we forgive ourselves for our mistakes? She asked quietly, flexing the hand in Addie's curls. The pile of regrets in the back of her mind throbbed, like a tooth compulsively prodded. Dumbledore's eyes stopped twinkling. He who learns to do that may be the wisest of us all. In the silence that followed, James took a deep breath. Well, Archie, you've managed to depress even Dumbledore. You're officially the wet blanket of the party. She snorted. I am the common denominator, aren't I? I know you don't want to hear it, Lily, but this situation requires serious intervention, he added. Lily rolled her eyes. A Weasley would do just as well, and you know it. Rigel nodded. One ought never convene a circle without a Weasley. Only solemnity can follow. There are certainly enough of them to go around, Gareth muttered. James's face was animated as he gathered steam. They ought to start a public utility company, get your Weasley. Instant levity to any moment. Take a set of twins, double your money, Lily suggested. Rigel gave a wry grin. Discounts on the acrimonious she Weasley. One of a kind. Dumbledore hummed doubtfully. Miss Weasley would be unlikely to participate in such a venture. She'd shave her head first, Rigel agreed. When I'm pressed to explain the unlikely friendship between the Potters and Blacks, I reference these nonsensical interludes. Raoul looked between Rigel and her parents with pure bemusement on his face. James shrugged and Lily frowned thoughtfully. I wonder if we learned it from Sirius or Sirius from us. I'm convinced our families share a particularly mad gene somewhere in. They were cut short by a cry of rage that had been magnified tenfold on the wings of a sonorous charm. Addie woke at once and screeched for her mother, but Lily had drawn her wand. She held up a hand toward Rigel and said, "Keep her." Rigel clutched Addie tightly, despite the toddler's attempts at diving toward her primary caregiver. Was that? James looked to Dumbledore. Alastair. Dumbledore gestured to the ground beneath him, and it obligingly rose in a wave of earth that sent the rest of them stumbling backwards. The mound carried the wizard up a dozen feet, where he swept the horizon with a terrifyingly calm stare. The apparition point. James set off at a run. Lily took one step after him, but checked herself with a glance at Rigel and Addie. "We'll be fine here," she started to say. Dumbledore interrupted as he descended from his vantage point. The earth smoothed out beneath him like a blanket under the hand of an experienced maid. "There's no immediate danger." His blue eyes caught Rigel's. "Your services may be required, Mr. Black." He made for the apparition point in long strides that reminded Rigel how tall the headmaster was. Rigel relinquished Addie to Lily's bewildered arms and started after him. "You've got your pendant," Lily called after her. She touched it and nodded, unworried. Dumbledore wouldn't lead one of his students into danger. They approached the apparition point and found James and Moody bent over a prone figure in the shadow of the tree line. Molly and Arthur reached them at the same time, wands at the ready and a ghostly pallor in their cheeks. "Not Andy's girl," Molly moaned, one hand coming up to her lips as she got a look at the crumpled body. Arthur's grip on his wand was white-knuckled as he stared into the trees. "Attackers. Dumped her here and left," Moody growled. He had fingers on his trainee's pulse and murder in his eyes. "Bled her first, but she's hanging on." Rigel hurried forward and dropped to her knees beside the young woman, trying not to notice how her hair had reverted to its natural brown color. Her chest barely moved, and up close she realized Moody wasn't taking her pulse, he was holding her neck together. She swept her magic out and took over the stanching while assessing the extent of the damage. Pulse not palpable, punctured trachea, hematoma over the anterior aspect of the neck, plus the neck laceration. "Roll her over. I'm going to stabilize the cervical spine." She wasn't fully aware of Moody following her instruction, most of her attention was on knitting the girl's airways back together while keeping the bleeding in check. When the trachea had fused, she immediately set her magic to the manual circulation of airflow through the lungs while the rest of her focus shifted to repairing the carotid artery. "You can let go, now," she murmured. Moody released his pressure on the young woman's neck, and blood immediately oozed out of the skin lesion. He went to put his hand back, but she stopped him. "It's fine. Her blood vessels are healed, see how there's no pressure to the leak. That's just the hematoma draining." She inspected the esophagus, double-checked the spine and the delicate vocal cords, and cleared residual blood from the site before closing the surface wound. She withdrew her magic carefully, waiting until the patient's system had taken over completely before switching to diagnostics. Rigel dug into her pocket for a blood replenisher. Moody caught her arm as she moved it toward his trainee and growled, "You just happen to have that on you, do you?" "It's one of several emergency potions I always carry with me," she said. "I also have pain reliever, modified weightless draft, fever reducer, nutrient potion, and a bazaar. James stared at her. She shrugged. Harry insists. Her father nodded. That checks out, Moody. Harry carries an entire library of potions when she goes anywhere. I can't say it hasn't proved useful. When Moody continued to glare suspiciously at her, she reminded him, she's lost at least a couple pints. Her blood pressure won't recover until there's more in her veins. He took the vial and held it up to the sun, swirling it. He inspected the cork seal, popped it open, and let a drop fall into his palm. Once satisfied, he handed it back with a scull. Rigel spelled the contents into the woman's stomach, then sat back on her heels. Give that a minute, then it's safe to wake her. Molly bustled the two of them out of the way. There's still time to get that stain out, she said with a hiccup. Her lips trembled, but her wand was steady as she siphoned the blood from Tonk's clothing. She'll want to be presentable when she wakes, Molly murmured, more to herself, it seemed. Andy won't want to see all the. She took a deep breath and met Arthur's pained gaze. On our own land, Arthur. How could this have happened? They got her somewhere else, James said. Dumbledore would have noticed at once if someone uninvited crossed the wards. She didn't apparate herself here in that state, Arthur said slowly. Moody brushed Molly's hovering hands away and searching Tonk's pockets efficiently. He pulled out a scrap of paper and a growl escaped him. How many times have I told her to memorize the bloody coordinates? He crumpled the parchment in a fist. Someone sidelonged her here on purpose. It's a message, Dumbledore. Our people aren't safe. Dumbledore's eyes were focused on something far away, and his voice was heavy with consideration for a dozen variables Rigel would probably never understand. Nymphadora is yet to be inducted. There is no more reason to target her than any other child of the light. Less, as her training presents a harder defense than the average witch or wizard. Perhaps she was in the wrong place at the wrong time, James said quietly. There are no coincidences in this world, Moody spat. Evil does not discriminate, Molly murmured. Humans do, though. Moody glared at Rigel. Wake her. Rigel roused the young woman with a gentle renovate. Tonks came to like a fish leaping from the water, with a gasp, her hand shot to her neck and she sat up so fast she almost head-butted Rigel. Vampire was the first word from her lips. Her eyes caught Moody, and her entire demeanor calmed at once. Sir. I was accosted en route to the apparition point near my apartment. Two men in rough garb. One in his late teens, dark skin and long hair. The other was 6 foot, but wore a cloth mask that obscured his face. I had my wand out, facing them, when something faster than my eye could track got me from behind. It moved like a vampire, and I thought it bit me, but... She felt along the ridge of her newly patched neck, and shivered. That was a knife wound, not a bite, Rigel said. Tonks absorbed the information soberly. Did you patch me up, little cousin? Sorry I couldn't fix your face, too, Rigel offered with a lopsided grin. Tonks turned her nose into a pig's snout and snorted at her. Focus, Moody snarled. Tonks let her face relax into its true shape and frowned. They didn't ask me any questions. Didn't even spout propaganda or insults at me. Just. Tonks touched her neck again. So suddenly, she murmured. Rigel pressed her lips together even as her heart shook with a memory. A shadowed alley. A blue vest. Death was always a surprise. How did I get here? Tonks asked suddenly. They apparated you here with the coordinates in your pocket, Moody said gruffly. Tonks blanched. Is everyone, did they try anything? Sweet Merlin, I put you all in danger. They'd be mad to move directly against Dumbledore, Arthur said firmly. Everyone is fine, dear, Molly added soothingly. Your mother is here. Andromeda. Tonks bore down on them with a storm in her eyes. In that moment, she really did look astonishingly like Bellatrix. Mum. Tonks glanced down at her robes, but Molly had gotten most of the blood off already. Are you quite finished interrogating my child, Moody? Andromeda moved the man away from her daughter with the sheer force of her gaze. I'm fine, Mum, Tonks croaked. You are fine only thanks to your cousin's magic, Andromeda snapped. She turned a challenging stare to Dumbledore. I am taking my daughter home. With a withering glance at Moody, she added quietly, "She's not a soldier yet." She set her hand firmly on Tonks' shoulder and disapparated them both with a twisting pop. Dumbledore appeared pained, his head bowed slightly. "To Arthur and Molly," he said, "I think it wise for the rest of us to follow suit." His gaze shifted to Rigel. "Brilliant application of Madame Pomfrey's teachings, Mr. Black. If we were on school grounds, I would award Slytherin 200 house points." She felt her mouth hitch. "It's for the best, then. Professor Snape would have been hospitalized for shock." James choked on a laugh he stifled too late. Rigel turned to give him a long hug. "I'm going to round up the other students. Say goodbye to Dad for me." James squeezed her hard and promised he would. "Good work, Archie. Really, really, well done. It seems I'm constantly thanking Godric for your interest in healing." "It's only because of Mum," she murmured quietly into his chest. "I never wanted to be the one watching someone die again." James' voice was thick. "Diana would be so proud of you. We all are. You're gonna be better than all of us." They broke apart, both composing themselves as the Weasleys and Dumbledore pretended not to notice. Moody just scowled at them. "Are you ready to work now, Hedera?" James put on his hard face and took out his wand. "I'll trace the last dozen coordinates. If they apparated her somewhere else before coming here, we might find a connection to them." Rigel accompanied Dumbledore to the other side of the lawn, picking up Hogwarts students as they went. He fashioned them a new portkey with calm efficiency, using a conjured length of rope to anchor the magic, which Rigel hadn't known was even possible. Before the sick feeling of dread in her stomach was overtaken by the literal nausea of the activated portkey, Rigel met Dumbledore's eyes and understood the regret that nested there. She summoned a rueful smile, realizing it had been foolish to seek some kind of respite at the soiree. There was no escape from their cold reality. -0. HP. -0. A letter of heavy vellum landed on Rigel's plate with a dull thump that drew the attention of her yearmates at once. Millicent actually leaned around Pansy to admire the smooth texture. "Is that vintage calfskin?" Pansy plucked it from Rigel's hand so she could see it better. "With moonglass ink, no less." Millie raised her eyebrows. "Are you corresponding with a duke, Rigel?" "The vizier of a small kingdom, perhaps." "Someone French?" Pansy guessed. Rigel took the letter back and gently untied the soft black ribbon. As she opened it to reveal ornate calligraphy in shimmering moonstone grey, the girl sighed in appreciation. "Who is it from?" Millicent wheedled. "And where do they shop?" Pansy added with a grin. She skipped down to the signature and smiled. "Just an old-fashioned colleague. From the Potions Guild." Rigel tilted her head. "He's not technically a member, I suppose. More of an enthusiast. How old is he?" Draco eyed the letter with a hard-to-read look. "Ancient," Rigel said, amused. After a few more appreciative comments about the smoothness of the vellum and fluid, uninterrupted lines of script, her friends went back to their breakfast. She pushed her plate to the side and dove into the letter's content properly. "Esteemed friend. In response to your query regarding our coven's well-being, we are not well at all. My laboratory was spared the conflagration, but several of my animals perished of smoke inhalation. Grandfather is most irate. The loss of his lieutenant is a foul blow. He is not technically perished, rather, lost in the literal sense. Since discovering his empty sickbed, Irvina stalks the alleys, bereft. I suspect she will not find him. Sometimes, when one of our kind senses the end is near, he will abandon his mate so she does not have to witness the passing. I am ignorant to the nature of what evil poison affected Gavril so. Grandfather did not permit me to take his blood for examination. Even still, the most curious effects of mental deceleration, memory loss, and confusion lead me to suspect an unusual neurotoxin. I mean unusual in the sense that it would be capable of affecting our kind. Of course, I trust you know that such effects are not unusual at all in neurotoxins generally. I thank you for your concern, and for your munificent offer to assist in replacing lost ingredients, should there have been any. Fear not, for my work continues apace. Yours in common purpose. Carsten. Vampire. That's what Tonks said. Rigel closed the letter mechanically, worry making her fingers stiff. The Lamia's attack and Gavril's subsequent disappearance, Tonk's superhuman attacker, were they related? It seemed a large coincidence, but perhaps only because she was connected to both situations. Moody's voice echoed ominously in her memory. There are no coincidences in this world. Bad news? Draco asked, catching the frown on her face. Rigel nodded. It seems there are grim tidings everywhere these days. This will cheer you up, then. Pansy pushed a copy of the Daily Prophet toward her. Rigel looked down, and the headline date set for landmark legislation vote screamed back at her. Rigel's heart clenched, but Millicent was quick to reassure her. It's set to the end of the session, see. Mid-June. Dumbledore's faction managed to buy a few extra weeks. Theo grumbled through his sausage. For what good that will do them? Her heartbeat slowed. After the tournament, then. Relief swept through her, a cool breeze after the sweltering humidity of stress. Rigel smiled. One thing had finally gone in her favor. As long as she won the tournament, Riddle could not directly intervene in the vote. He had carried it this far, but would have to rely on momentum to get it across the finish line. And she would be there waiting with every ally the light could muster standing in its way. -0. HP. -0. At 3 a.m. on Sunday morning, Rigel worked to the sound of her cousin calling her name softly from the mirror she kept under her pillow. Rigel, PSSST, Rigel. Groggily, and accompanied by her roommate's annoyed grumbles, she pulled out the mirror and mumbled into it. Hang on, Harry. Oh, good, you're up. SHHHH. She tucked her toes into slippers and stumbled in her crumpled robes to the common room. Is this an emergency? She asked through a yawn. Her cousin didn't sound frantic, but one never knew with Archie. Yes and no. No, then. The fires were low, but imminently coaxable. She stoked one higher and pulled a silver throw over to a low-backed armchair, settling into the comfortable cushion with a sigh. All right, cause. What is it? I'm in the common room, mind. Great, no worries, I've got Hermione here, actually. She felt her eyebrow twitch. Now he tells her. Hermione, how are you? The curly-haired witch leaned into the mirror next to Archie. Hi, Rigel. Sorry to wake you. I forgot about the time change in my excitement, but, I mean, this is really something. I think. It really is. Archie confirmed. What is? Well. Hermione trailed off, unusually tentative. I don't even know where to start, she said helplessly. Topic? Rigel asked with another yawn. The fade. Some of her sleepiness vanished. Right. Give me a moment, actually. Binny. Who? Not you. Binny popped into the common room with the look of curious expectation common to house elves when they answered a call on instinct alone. Young Master Black. You is really calling me so late? Rigel smiled sheepishly. Sorry, Binny. Could I trouble you for a cup of strong tea? Binny's eyes crinkled in pleasure. Binny is happy to provide. A cup of English black tea appeared on the small table beside her armchair, and Rigel thanked the elf before returning to the mirror. Armed with her wits after the first couple of sips, she said, I'm ready. Tell me everything. Archie set the mirror on some surface and moved back a bit so she could see them both. Hermione's hair had reached supernova levels of mass, and she had a scab on her lip from where she had nearly chewed it through. Rigel braced herself. You know, I've been working on an experiment to test my theory of core replenishment, Hermione began. Rigel nodded. I didn't understand all of it in your letter. I hadn't really grounded it yet, but now I have, Hermione said breathlessly. You see, I think everything wizards believe about their magic is a lie. She blinked. That's something. I know how it sounds, there's no other explanation, though. Oh, I'm doing this all wrong. Hermione took a breath. Sorry. The experiment, Archie prompted gently. Yes. I disproved the hypothesis that wizards create their own magic. Rigel choked on her tea. You what? It's the most fundamental assumption to all the research, and I just thought, what if we're wrong? So I designed a ward that blocked the flow of ambient magic through the air. Hermione spoke very quickly, as though the explanation has been building inside of her like a river behind a dam. It was a two-part experiment. I used several classmates with different affinities in both parts. First, I found an obscure spell that measures the density of magic by volume and used it to measure the ambient magic within a set of my magic impermeable wards. Then, I introduced a subject who had cast several high-powered spells in quick succession, making their core fatigued. After allowing them sufficient time to recover their magical reserves, I measured the ambient magic within the wards again and, it decreased. Hermione took a deep breath as Rigel opened and closed her mouth soundlessly for a few moments. You invented a set of perfectly impermeable wards for this experiment. Most wards were designed to block active magic, shaped magic, not ambient wild magic. One may as well block the molecules of the air itself. But Hermione had done it. And that wasn't even the most incredible thing she'd said. And you, wait, so you're saying wizards draw on the magic in the air when we replenish our own stores? That's... I know. But I reverse tested it, too. Hermione said it forcefully, evidently aware of how completely earth-shattering her theory was. Part 2 of the experiment involved placing a magic-fatigued individual inside a ward that had already been depleted of ambient magic. I wanted to see if it would take longer for them to recover without the help of the ambient magic, and they didn't, though. Every one of the subjects remained core fatigued until they left the ward. Do you see what that means? Not only do we tap into the wild magic around us whenever we replenish our magic, but we are dependent on it entirely, Rigel. The air left her lungs in a whoosh. Hermione, she croaked. That's... I know. We know, Archie added, sounding a bit shell-shocked himself. Rigel gulped the rest of her tea and marshaled her thoughts quickly. We don't produce magic, we absorb it. She tested the words on her tongue, wonderingly. How does that explain the way the inner core feeds the outer core, she asked. For that matter, why do we have affinities at all, instead of purely neutral magic, if it's all wild magic? Hermione shook her head. I don't know exactly, but I have to theorize that some mechanism in the structure of the inner core alters the magic as it is absorbed. There is energy being used in the process of replenishment. Plenty of studies prove that food and rest are key to a fast recovery. But what if the energy we use goes to shaping the magic, adjusting it to match our own personal signatures as it is incorporated into our cores? Rigel nodded slowly. That could be, Hermione, this is terrifying. Brilliant, but really, utterly terrifying, do you realize that? Yes. A slightly hysterical laugh escaped the girl. I expect the idea that wizards are just sentient plants photosynthesizing will generate some controversy. Controversy? People will riot in the streets, she said faintly. This turns on its head the very idea that magic belongs to wizards. Merlin, there are people that believe it comes from a wizard's very soul. Archie grinned. All along, our greatest arrogance was assuming we own this spectacular thing inside of us at all. Exactly. Hermione burst out. Magic isn't yours or mine. It belongs to the world. Magic belongs to the world. Riddle's words in Hermione's mouth. Something fundamental about the universe had surely cracked in two. Then, the implications were dizzying. Back to the fade, Archie reminded Hermione. Oh. Yes, so then, babies don't produce their own magic either, don't you see? They absorb it. That's the mechanism that must be broken. Transmitting magic to their cores doesn't help, because they don't know what to do with it. Hermione's eyes were bright through the mirror. Rigel, if we can isolate the exact way the core alters the wild magic to make it storable, we'll finally have a real cause for the fade. Why the fading, though? Why do the babies waste away? Rigel murmured the question out loud, trying to connect all the dots. Their bodies are still throwing energy at the problem, Hermione guessed. It's just not being used correctly. The mother's supply of magic is cut off, and by the time the baby needs to convert wild magic and can't, it's already dependent on magic to survive. Explain Muggleborns, then, or half-bloods whose mother is non-magic, Rigel challenged. Hermione grimaced. I've been wondering about that too. I don't know yet. Archie ventured a suggestion. Do you think the initial donation of mother's magic during a magical pregnancy influences the way the infant learns to shape the magic it absorbs? What do you mean? Hermione demanded. Well, it might explain why certain affinities or traits can run in a family, aside from genealogy, Archie said. Genetics. Hermione trailed off as her eyes lost focus. Yes, maybe there's a faulty gene expression involved. Rigel frowned. I'm not really versed in genes, beyond the basic inherited traits theory. I'll look into that portion of it, Hermione said, waving a hand dismissively. Then I'll try to isolate the mechanism of conversion you're talking about, Rigel offered. That's going to be the hardest part, Hermione cautioned. The cause inner workings are entirely mysterious, which is why no one has proved this theory before. I have a way of seeing into a person's core, Rigel said. Archie made a noise of realization. That's right. Your core diving thing. Core diving? Hermione's eyebrows furrowed. It's a freaky, unique thing only Rigel can do, Archie said helpfully. His, not wrong. His. Hermione seemed skeptical, but said, all right. I'll leave that part to you, then. What can I do? Archie asked. Look into what is known about Muggle-born magical development, Rigel suggested. I think we're missing something there, but most of the literature I've seen treats Muggle-borns as non-entities until they turn up at school at 11. Sorry, she added as Hermione winced. It's true. We're identified too late. If only there was some way of finding Muggle-borns at birth. Hermione's expression was torn for a moment, but cleared with a sharp breath. My next project, perhaps. After you cure the incurable fate, you mean, Archie said, elbowing her with a grin. Hermione cracked a smile in return. One thing at a time, as my father likes to say. Or all things simultaneously, as my father likes to say. No one should take research advice from your father, Rigel said, shaking her head. He comes up with lots of ideas. And never sees them through. Remus has to do all the technical work. Because Dad's an artist. I'm sure they all bring something to the team, Hermione said. She glanced between Archie and the mirror and added, just like us. Team Cure. Archie crowed. Team Cure, Rigel repeated. For the first time, she let herself believe it. -0. HP. -0. Even halfway through the brewing, she couldn't believe it. Her hands felt as light as soap bubbles, as though the ingredients were adding themselves, and her magic slept peacefully in her core, undisturbed. Her head of house grew quieter and more still as the minutes dragged near to an hour and not a single thing happened. Rigel finished the potion and set down her stirring rod. She turned the fire off with tingling fingers, her eyes searching for something in Snape's face. Approval. Respect. Both were there, but the third thing trapped the breath of relief in her chest. I think it will work, she said. I am certain it will. Snape shifted his gaze to the cauldron, where an innocuous alkaline brine glistened, and a crease like a smile folded into his jaw. You. He cleared his throat. I have never seen anyone complete an original free brew without stifling unstable magic even once. She smoothed a hand down the front of her pristine apron, soothing the glow of pride in her belly. Perhaps we should end on that auspicious note, then. Snape inclined his head with a right tilt. You've done enough tonight for the annals of potioneering history. Rigel bottled the potion and stopped each dose carefully. She set the bottles on one of the spare workbenches, and said, I've no real use for a dozen vials of homesick relief. Perhaps you could test them on first-year Hufflepuffs next term. A clinical trial would be valuable experience in your medicinal potions education, Snape agreed, sly amusement hidden in a deceptively dry tone. He wouldn't really use them before the Ministry approved the brew for human consumption, but he also didn't refuse the doses. Knowing that she'd created something good enough for Master Snape to keep around sent another round of warmth through her stomach. She carried the cauldron to the sink to scrub it clean, and Snape began meticulously reshelving the leftover ingredients. They worked in companionable silence, until Snape asked, What were you thinking, while you brewed? Rigel slowed the water and spoke over the tinny sound of it hitting the metal cauldron. I wasn't thinking anything, really. It was as though, have you seen the acromantula nests in the forest? Snape let out a bark of laughter. You think yourself akin to a spider in its web. She scowled at him good-naturedly. It was like that. My mind was suspended over everything in perfect understanding, but connected to dozens of avenues at once. I could see all the ways it could turn out, without really consciously playing through them. Her professor considered that for a moment before asking, "Do you play chess?" Rigel chuckled. "We're more of a checkers family. Even the werewolf." She frowned at his use of the descriptor, but admitted, "Uncle Remus did try to teach us. I know enough to draw out a game, but I find it frustratingly limited. In real life, the pieces are more flexible." He raised an eyebrow as he closed the cupboard. "How so?" Rigel gestured to the castle around them. "If Hogwarts was a piece, do you really think it would only move back and forth in the corner?" Snape snorted. "Hogwarts would have an entirely invisible dimension in which only it could move." "Exactly. And the king, he's artificially restrained in chess. In situations that are not battles, which is most situations in the modern world, the king has a much more expansive role." "Who is the king?" "The minister." She eyed him with disappointment. "Dumbledore, of course." She returned to rinsing the cauldron and bit out, "Riddle for black, I suppose." "The ministry is the board they play on, if anything." "What am I?" Snape asked, a dangerous edge to his voice. "A knight." She flashed him a grin. "The Weasleys got that one right, sir." He sneered. "And what are you?" "I'm not on the board," she said quickly. "Your denial is fathomless. But not unexpected." He shook his head at that, but let the subject go. She set the cauldron upside down to dry and they wiped down the surfaces together. "What will my next assignment be?" she asked as she pried the lid off the oil tin. "What would you like it to be?" Rigel grinned. "I want to dive deeper into dragon's blood as a signifying ingredient. Dangerous and unpredictable, your inner lion is showing. No ambition is realized without risk," she teased. Snape took the oil rag from her fingers with a sniff. "Quoting Saw won't get you out of everything. What about, nothing is lost for striving, striving at every turn and striving despite the odds. Have you swallowed a book of Slytherin sayings? Draco keeps flashcards in his pockets." Snape snorted. "He does not." "How do you know about flashcards?" "Aunt Lily swears by them. She keeps all her ideas pinned up on a board in the basement." She trailed off as Snape's expression closed. After a moment's hesitation, she said, "Did Dumbledore mention what she's working on?" He shook his head sharply. "We do not speak of such things." "Well, she's invented runic expressions for describing the exact properties of dark magic." Rigel took out the amulet and held up the disc. He glanced at it briefly. "Then she created this amulet to detect and counter those specific signatures. I'm sorry if I'm overstepping, but no one else knows what you've done, so no one else can tell you this, sir. Because of Aunt Lily's work in experimental magic, work that you secured for her, the most dangerous dark arts are one step closer to being blunted. I'll say it for all the people who can't ever know, thank you." Snape set the old cauldron down and stared hard at her. "That is quite enough." "It won't ever be enough," she shot back. His eyes flared in warning and she subsided to a calmer tone. "Some things cannot be repaid in thanks alone. Some things are not done in anticipation of repayment." She bowed her head in acknowledgement of that. "I'll pay it forward, then. What you've taught me, potions and all the rest. I'll pass it on one day." Snape drew his composure around himself like a cape. "If you intend to publish a memoir, you'd best ensure I'm dead in my grave first." Rigel huffed. "Skeeter will get to you before I do." He narrowed his eyes. "That may be the most harrowing curse I've ever heard. One day, young Slytherins will be quoting me. If you think your past statements reflect wisdom, you must not remember any of them." She affected an offended eyebrow raise. "I am profound, Professor. Ask anyone." He crossed his arms. "Shall I choose a few at random?" He put on a guileless tone that was so out of place she choked. "But Professor, how does a doxy even make eggs if they have no—" Rigel cleared her throat loudly. "No need to spoil the ending. She wrinkled her nose. Only promise if I die in the next task that won't be on my headstone. Snape stiffened. Do not joke about such things. You are not invincible, Rigel. She sobered. I know that, I really do. The wand in her pocket buzzed, and she checked the time with a grimace. Damn. Sorry, sir. I promised Dre I would. She groped for a moment before offering, play exploding snap tonight. Her head of house tapped his fingers on the counter. Ah. I suppose that is where Draco, Miss Parkinson, and dozens of other students from all 4 houses have been disappearing to on the 7th floor every week. An exploding snap league, is it? Rigel swallowed soundlessly and nodded, belatedly reinforcing her occlumency shields. How unexpected, he drawled. I thought for certain it was an underground dueling club. She forced a laugh, the words plausible deniability pulsing in her brain. That would be so sneaky and irresponsible, Professor. Definitely not something Pansy would be involved in. Saying nothing of the others. Well. She closed her mouth. After a beat of silence, Snape rolled his eyes. Go make your exploding snap appointment, Rigel. She backed slowly out of the room, her feet pushing across the cushioned floor in soft bounces. Great. I will, sir. She hung up her protection gear and reclaimed her bag at the door. About the next assignment. I will speak to Albus about it and we will revisit your ideas after the last task. After the task, great. See you later, Professor. Mind you don't exhaust yourself with that card game. She fled before he could make any further insinuations, wondering how she ought to break it to Draco that Snape had known about their illegal dueling club all along. -0. HP. -0. Draco had the club warming up when she slipped into the room of requirement. Rigel jogged over to where Pansy was demonstrating a truly gamine stretching position and took a spot between her friend and a blushing Ravenclaw who was very pointedly not looking. That stretch should come with a warning label, Rigel said, grinning. The stretch is the warning label, Pansy retorted, sending the flustered Ravenclaw a wink. She flicked her eyes over Rigel's brewing robes and trusty boots. You're going to exercise in that? Rigel shrugged. It's already dirty. Pansy raised an eyebrow. You don't think we can give you a real challenge? She winced. Don't put words in my mouth. You're right, though. Pansy bent at the waist and looked up at her with her cheek pressed to her ankle. You've outgrown this club. Be honest, do you come just to support Draco? Maybe I come for your stretching. Pansy flipped her hair in Rigel's general direction. I've reconciled my inability to sway you, Ry. It helps that everyone else has failed, too. Thanks. Rigel shook her head. Stretch, Rigel. Draco called from his place in the center of the room. Can't have our champion pulling a muscle 2 days before the last task. Rigel lifted a hand in mock salute. Aye, mon capitaine. When everyone was limbered to Draco's satisfaction, he ran the advanced students through a new set of footwork and set up a line of dummies for the younger students to practice fly pendo. It was achingly normal. Contrary to Pansy's prediction, Rigel worked up a decent sweat getting down the new patterns, and she gratefully accepted a cup of water from the ringleader himself when the session wrapped up for the evening. I can't believe you wore your potions get up to practice, Draco said, giving her the same once-over that Pansy had. I came straight from the lab, Rigel said between gulps. She wiped her mouth and remembered her conversation with Snape. And this is in no way my fault, but Snape definitely knows about the... Seriously, Rigel. You can't keep one secret from the man. She shook her head quickly. It wasn't me, Dre. I told him I had to go play Exploding Snap and he said, oh, I thought you had an illegal club to get to or something. Exploding Snap. That was the best you could come up with. I lost track of time, all right. My alarm went off right in the middle of... Boys, what are we arguing about? Pansy took the cup from Rigel's hand to refill it from a room-provided pitcher. Rigel told Snape about the club. Draco thinks I can't keep a secret. Pansy dumped the water on Rigel's head. While she spluttered and wiped at her eyes, Pansy calmly refilled the glass and tossed it in Draco's face. You're both ridiculous. Snape is smart enough to have figured it out himself, Draco. As Rigel let out a triumphant sound, Pansy spoke over her. And Rigel is conspicuous enough in Snape's field of view to have led him straight here. She set the pitcher down on its table and planted her hands on her hips. Regardless, you're both wrong. I told Snape. Rigel and Draco gaped at her. She sighed. Honestly. You think it's a coincidence that all the members' detentions have been conveniently deconflicted? That none of the other teachers have grown suspicious? We needed an ally on staff. Snape expressly forbid me from running this club, Draco hissed. Yes, Draco. Snape openly and expressly told you not to have a club. Pansy's face clearly said, do you see it yet? Draco opened his mouth, shut it again, and crossed his arms defensively. Uncle Sev is very convincing. Rigel patted him on the back. In truth, Draco had no idea how many masks his godfather wore. Just be glad to have such a powerful piece on our side. Uncle Sev's not a piece, he's a player. I'm going to delete that sentence from my memory, Fred declared loudly from over Draco's shoulder. Draco spun around. That isn't what I meant. Too late. Deleted. Thanks for the subconscious trauma, Captain. What are you eavesdropping for anyway? George appeared on Draco's other side and leaned a heavy arm on the boy's shoulder before he could escape. So glad you asked. We were thinking this might be the last chance to catch Rigel before the big to-do. Consider me caught, Rigel said, intrigued. Have you another firework display for me to show off? Firstly, yes. George pressed a dangerously innocuous disc into her palm with a grin that invited her to join him in epic anticipation. And speaking of lighting one off, what say we take a trip down to the kitchens for a little pre-accomplishment celebration? Fred waggled his eyebrows at each of them in turn. Pansy smiled. Isn't it bad luck to celebrate before winning? Bad taste, maybe, but luck. Who needs it? George slung an arm around Rigel's shoulder and turned his best puppy-eyed pout on Pansy. Doesn't Rigel deserve to unwind a bit? We've noticed a few new grey hairs, Fred added, plucking one from her head without so much as a by your leave. He examined the perfectly black hair for a moment before letting it fall, pretending not to notice Rigel wandlessly vanishing it as it hit the floor. As your friends and advisors, we're concerned for your health. And your sanity. And your funness, which overall seems much diminished of late. Will it appease your disquiet if I go and have cake in the kitchens with you? Rigel asked on a laugh. It's a good start, George said seriously. Rigel gestured for them to lead the way. Fred cupped his hand over his mouth and shouted to the entire room, after party in the kitchens. A general cheer went up, and before Rigel could wonder if she'd let the twins pull her farther from shore than was wise, she was caught in the riptide of students marching gaily down to the basement. If any professors had come across the mixed group of sweaty teens, they'd have strained credulity with any story they could have fabricated. They burst through the portrait hole amidst numerous exclamations from those in their party who had never traversed the elves' territory. Binny met them with crossed arms and a stern expression as her fellows froze in the midst of polishing the dinnerware. You is bringing the whole school tonight, Mr. and Mr. Weasleys. Fred looked over his shoulder in exaggerated surprise while George said, us. They're not here with us. They is spontaneously finding their way here. Binny squinted up at them. Fred snapped his fingers. By George, I think we were followed. By Fred, I'm certain we were. Rigel pushed her way to the front of the crowd. Binny, good evening. Our apologies for the intrusion. Binny dipped a curtsy. Mr. Black, you is always welcome. The elf ignored the twins' miming tears as they held one another. Is you bringing Mr. Draco? It's his illegal club, Ron called from the back. Binny clapped her hands and two elves jumped up from the pile of silver. Tarts. Many and quickly. Rigel shot her friend a grin as his ears turned pink. This is why we love you, Binny. Binny is loving all of Hogwarts students, the elf said solemnly. She leaned close enough for her champagne cork necklace to brush Rigel's knee and added, but Mr. Black is being extra special. She used to say we were special, George mourned. Guard your heart, Rigel, that she-elf is fickle as a boggart, Fred lamented. That she hasn't murdered you both in your bed speaks volumes to her steadiness and loyalty, Ron said flatly. Binny flicked her fingers and one of the long tables cleared itself. At a twitch of her left ear, a sumptuous tablecloth rolled a path from end to end, and with a twirl of her pinky, flagons of pumpkin juice crowded the center. The round of applause that burst from the group set Binny to curtsying again. Mind you is in bed before curfew, she cautioned. Thank you, Binny Rigel said as her schoolmates crowded the table with empty goblets. The elves who had jumped to at Binny's command were already ferrying piles of raspberry tarts to the table, and the flurry of new activity in the kitchen promised a plethora of treats to follow. The elves pretended not to notice when Fred and George spiked one of the flagons, and Rigel pretended not to notice when Draco poured himself a generous helping. She took a sausage stuffed roll and held her hand over the top of her goblet when George went to top her plain juice off with something stronger. It's a celebration, Rigel, he wheedled. I'll celebrate properly when it's over, she promised. That's the difference between our houses, George said with a grin. We celebrate first, because a Gryffindor does not assume he's going to see the end of the fight. Rigel considered her goblet seriously. Hadn't she said something similar to her head of house? Perhaps it was foolish to put off gaiety until a time of perfect, uncomplicated peace. With the rate at which she picked up problems, there was a good chance that day would never come. George grimaced. It was only a joke, Rigel. I know you'll make it through all. One cup. She took her hand away from the rim and let him fill it to the brim. George's smile was back full blast. To heroes. He clinked their cups together soundly. To friends. She tossed back a large gulp before it could slosh too much over her hand. To the Hogwarts champion. Someone leaned over from behind her and tapped their cup to hers, and she drank politely. To Rigel's victory. That call came from Ron, but at the answering round of cheers, she lifted her own glass again. If only that were the end of it. To Rigel's strength. To Rigel's cunning. To his loyalty. No, to his erudite hickness. Draco laughed lowly as he slid into a seat beside her. To Rigel's patience. He clinked their cups and Rigel took a very small sip while staring at him over the top of the rim. Saw laser, if you could feel the enmity coming off you right now. To Rigel's iron stomach. Fred set the group off again, and Rigel slammed her empty goblet down on the table. Thank you, that's quite enough. The sweet pumpkin juice became cloying in combination with whatever the twins had used to supplement it, and she was not keen to put Fred's toast to the test. No such thing. Alden swiped another pitcher from George and refilled her goblet. Can't have an empty glass in front of our guest of honor. Rigel protested, I can't make myself sick 2 days before the last task. Her argument failed to impress him. The greatest young potions brewer this school has ever seen can surely make himself a draft in the morning. She could, at that. Still, there was something unprincipled about it, and she said so. George shook his head. If I've learned anything from Percy over the years, it's that it isn't fun to be the most principled person in the room. Nor is it wise to be the least, she retorted. George looked to where his brother was climbing on the end of the table with his tie wrapped around his head. No danger of that. Alden reached over to clink their cups. Go on, Rigel. You've been on edge for days. She frowned. I have not. You snarled at a first year yesterday, Draco reminded her. Rigel shot him a betrayed look. I just corrected his homework. You said the notion that dragon liver should ever be mixed with undiluted bulbatuber pus is so misguided as to border on sociopathic. She winced. Which one was that again? She had no recollection of using those exact words, but she should probably apologize. Caro, but he forgave you after getting an E on the assignment, Pansy said from Draco's other side. She sighed into her cup, but George clapped her smartly on the back. No moping, it's a party, Rigel. Or don't you have those in Slytherin? Rigel doesn't come to the parties, Draco said. His serious tone was somewhat blunted by the way his eyes blinked slow and heavy. Have you ever even been sloshed, then? She shook her head slowly, but stopped when she remembered. A little, when I was practicing for the 5th task. I didn't like it. Not surprising, if it was a form of survival training. Alden topped her glass off, then Draco's, then his own. To better reasons for drinking. To never going back in time and redoing the fifth task, she murmured. Only you would have to specifically rule that out. Draco sniggered. Edmund physically nudged Alden sideways on the bench and claimed the resulting space. Corrupting the fourth years, Al. For all you know, I'm saving their immortal souls. Saving it from what? Draco put a hand over his stomach, a bit protectively. Witches. Alden smirked at Pansy, who rolled her eyes. At Draco's confused look, Pansy shook her head. It's a muggle thing. Alden thinks he's being funny. So what else is new? Draco yawned into his goblet. Edmund, when's the stag party? You know it's my birthday in June, right? Are you asking because you want to combine the two or deconflict them? Alden's smile had points. Only I don't recall getting an invitation to your birthday party, Draco. The blonde boy wrinkled his nose. My parents only let me invite my yearmates. But anyone of age can come to the garden party, Pansy pointed out. Draco nodded enthusiastically. THA's right. You should both come this year. What's the average age at the Malfoy summer garden party? Over 100. Alden grinned into his palm. No thanks, mate. Oh. Yeah, true. Draco was still nodding, but much slower. When's the stag party, then? Edmund slid his heavy gaze to Alden. I'm afraid El's in charge of that. Alden leaned across the table on his hand, a smirk threatening to colonize his ear. Are you sure you're up to it? Draco attempted to draw himself upright, but was interrupted by a yawn. A Malfoy is up to anything. I don't know, it won't exactly be tailored to the 15 and under crowd. I'm sure you know I'm highly mature for my age. Exceedingly so, Rigel added dryly. Are you recommending him, Rigel? I might consider it then. Alden had pure mischief in his eyes as Draco looked blearily between the two of them. Rigel eyed her friend's unfocused gaze. He does hold his drink well, doesn't he? Draco inclined his head in thanks as Pansy smothered a sigh from his other side. So far, but the night is even younger than you lot. Alden filled Draco's cup again and Rigel began to silently calculate the doses of pain relief and sobering draught that would be most effective for someone of Draco's size and metabolic class. She stopped when the accelerating half-life coefficient started to waltz. Her head felt as though Dom had filled the mindscape with water again and set her thoughts to swimming. Rigel. Someone poked her in the side, and she jerked her gaze up from the table. Yes, George. You zoned out there for a spell. All right. She nodded. Then she considered the question and shook her head. I don't want any more. George downed the rest of her cup without hesitating. Then no more shall you have. With a grin, he added, you look more relaxed, anyway, which was the entire point. Rigel stiffened her spine with effort, mildly alarmed by that pronouncement. Relaxation was something to which she could never completely surrender. George laughed. Only you would see relaxation as the enemy. She blinked. Did I say that out loud? Yes, you did. George shook his head with a smile tugging on his lips. That's what happens when you toast a dozen times in a row, it all catches up to you at once. What did you put in the pumpkin juice? She asked, realizing that question was overdue. Not butterbeer, he said. Fairy wine, she guessed hopefully. Something stronger, the redhead admitted. We've been watching the young ones, though, no one's had too much. I have. You've had exactly as much as you needed. All of your friends have noticed you spinning yourself into orbit this week. Come back down to Earth for a night and remember that you're not taking on the whole world by yourself. She glanced around the table at the others. Alden and Edmund nodded in unqualified agreement, Pansy gave her a guilty grimace, and Draco had his head pillowed on his arms. He rolled onto one ear to murmur, you haven't been sleeping much. Rigel rubbed her temple. I have a lot on my mind. The maze. Edmund's rumbling voice gave weight to the phrase. She dropped her hand to her lap and clenched it into a fist. Yes. She'd spent too many hours to count staring up at the dark ceiling, wondering what awaited her in the hedges. You think it'll be bad? George asked quietly. She let out a slightly hysterical laugh. I keep wondering that. Will it somehow be worse than everything that came before? Or will it be anticlimactic? You're thinking about politics, too, Draco grumbled into the table. Of course she was. The dire possibilities shouted at her every time she closed her eyes. Would the legislation go through without Riddle's direct involvement after she won? Would the rights of half-bloods and muggle-borns alike flicker and die in a gust of pure-blood pride? Would the country explode into civil war to keep it from happening? Would anyone care at all? What if it's all for nothing, she whispered. You done more than anyone. Draco's mouth stretched into a yawn that he hid in his own elbow. He's right. Alden toasted her with his cup. Even if your plan doesn't work in the near term, you've hamstrung them for decades. Edmund frowned at his friend. What plan is this? Rigel wrinkled her nose. It's a great, complicated thing. A conspiracy, Draco agreed. You conspirators should be careful, Pansy said sharply. Being careful is all I ever do, Rigel said mournfully. No one watching from the outside would guess, George said wryly. He, too, looked curious, but after Pansy's warning, neither he nor Edmund pressed them. It's all inside. Rigel put a hand to her chest and tugged at her robes in frustration. Some days I'm so sick of it. Most days, I'm just really tired. I'm tired too, Draco offered. You shouldn't be so hard on yourself, Pansy said over Draco's slumped form. No one is asking more of you. They should. Rigel stared at Pansy. A sudden conviction reached into her throat and choked the words that came next. You should, Pan. I'm a big fraud, really. A fraud doesn't slay a basilisk or cure a deadly illness, Alden observed. 'Twasn't he deadly, Draco muttered. A fraud doesn't earn the trust and loyalty of so many, Edmund added evenly. Riddle did. The words came hoarsely as she let the comparison rankle. I don't deserve my friends. It's not about deserving. George's tone brooked no further argument. We're your friends forever, Rigel, whether you deserve it or not, Pansy said fiercely. No matter what you do, Alden agreed. Edmund slid his best friend a dry look. No matter how annoying you are. Rigel's mouth hitched for their sake. Thanks. They didn't know what they promised, but it didn't hurt to hear it. Fred sprawled into George's lap without warning, a laugh still on his lips. He looked about the group and fixed Rigel with an exasperated stare. Mate, I hate to tell you, but the cloud of doom and gloom that's been hovering over your head all year appears to be procreating. George dumped Fred onto the table, upsetting every glass in his path. Bite your tongue. Moroseness never met a more menacing match than me. Draco startled upright as juice doused his fair strands and Pansy gasped in displeasure as he shook the drops into her face. Alden leaned back on the bench and refilled his upturned cup from the river dripping off the edge of the table. He caught Rigel's eye and shrugged. See la vie, Rigel. Drink while there's drink. Make merry while you've friends to be merry with. Time enough for melancholy later, when you're alone. She watched Fred bowl himself down the length of the table to the accompaniment of general mayhem and felt her spirits lift a little. Time enough, indeed. -0. HP. -0. Music swanned across the lawn on the wings of the stadium's amplification spells. Descending from the castle with Draco and Pansy, Rigel saw a river of colored tents clustered about the main entrance to the pitch. The painted flags and souvenir stalls gave her a strong sense of déjà vu. It was like a very small World Cup, if most of the attendees had been sober. And children. Her friends flitted to the stalls, fingering sparkling commodities with the energy of those who did not have an invisible weight on their shoulders. Pansy held up a scarf with Rigel's image patterned in thread and grinned mischievously. Shall I pick up a few, for posterity's sake? Get Dre one for his birthday. Draco wrinkled his nose. I'd rather have the animated hat. Look, it even speaks parcel tongue. Rigel pressed her lips together at the incomprehensible spitting noises emanating from the headwear in question. With a straight face, she said, you should hear what it's saying about your mother. Draco dropped it in horrified surprise. That's not funny. Pansy's muffled laughter disagreed. The two moved on to a stand selling omniculars, and didn't notice immediately when Rigel drifted away. She caught a familiar face in her periphery and stole closer for a better look. Leo moved amidst a group of gaily dressed players, a pair of striped pantaloons accentuating his long legs as he marched with exaggerated aplomb. Bells on his shoes chimed sharply with every step, but it was his hands that drew the eye. They juggled half a dozen colored balls with the easy grace of old habit, weaving through the air like an artist with an invisible brush. She had to marvel at how well he fit. Leo was a chameleon, blending effortless in any surroundings. He engaged the crowd with an easy grin, charming smiles and even blushes from the Hogwarts students. Cora, resplendent in silver sequins, tossed one of her juggling knives toward Leo. He ducked, bells jangling as he shook with exaggerated fear. Another performer caught the knife as it sailed over Leo's head, and the crowd laughed as he shook a finger admonishingly at the precocious child. Rigel turned away before he spotted her. As nice as it was to see her friend, she wasn't prepared to speak to him as Archie. If there was one deception she could yet avoid, surely it was that one. -0. LH. -0. He watched the boy slip off without a word from the corner of his eye. Harry's cousin presented a curious puzzle. A pampered pureblood with a split personality who'd done much better than anyone expected in the high-profile tournament. The black scion came off obliviously chipper at first acquaintance, but scratch the facade and something surprisingly savvy lurked beneath. He didn't look so cheerful today, but Leo wouldn't either, were he in the boy's spot. A girl with long, raven hair tossed a galleon as he winked at her, an entire galleon, and wasn't it a bit sickening how much disposable income these children seemed to have? Cora goggled at the golden coin before her knives demanded her attention once more. The distraction cost her, and she stuck out a foot to hastily bounce the hilt of a knife back up into the air at the last moment. Several of the students whooped, and Cora smiled like she hadn't a care in the world. Like a galleon wouldn't feed her for 2 months. Archerus had rejoined his friends. Leo followed the boys' ambling progress toward the stadium without seeming to. He hoped for Harry's sake the boy made it through the night all right. The task was only half of it. Big Tony like this, sparkling in the public's imagination, would be an irresistible target to the likes of those wreaking havoc across the country of late. Judging by the number of plainclothesers skulking about, he wasn't the only one who expected the ugly side of humanity to rear its head. Leo tipped his cap to the audience as he swapped out with another performer. Jax caught his eye and nodded. If there was trouble like the cup, he and his troupe would help sort it. This time, they wouldn't have an entire brigade of players out their worldly possessions. Leo trailed Archerus and his friends from a subtle distance. At the least, he would see the boy got home to his cousin. For her sake. -0. HP. -0. Sport, over here. Is he talking to you? Draco murmured, a slightly disbelieving sneer on his mouth. Rigel waved to Sirius, who grinned back from his spot between Lily and Remus. That's my dad you're mocking. Not mocking, Draco protested. Just constantly questioning the sanity of. I'm not sure that made grammatical sense, Pansy muttered through the side of her polite smile. Rigel shook her head with a laugh. No need to strain your manners. I'll see you both after. Pansy took her in a brief hug. Be careful. Draco gave her a serious nod. Do your best, we'll be watching. I daren't let you down, she said, sweeping them a playful bow. Until we meet again. Good luck. Pansy called after her. They locked eyes until Draco tugged the blonde girl toward the stands. Rigel jogged over to her waiting family. You all came, huh? Sirius crushed her in a hug that was slightly too desperate to be a mere greeting. Course we did. How do you feel? Ready? She nodded, trying to project confidence and ease into her face. She would never be as convincing as Archie, but they would excuse any slips as nerves. Sirius stepped back and clenched his fists as though to stop himself reaching for her again. Last one, he said bracingly. You're going to be great, Remus said. Just remember the basics. I've been practicing like mad, she said, laughing embarrassedly. I hope it's enough. Lily reached out to touch the cord around her neck. You only have to come out alive, Archie. She nodded reassuringly, but inside, her heart clenched. If only it were that easy. Surviving wasn't enough, though. She had to win. Rigel. She turned. Professor Snape stood at an awkward distance, his hands in his robe pockets. He didn't acknowledge her family members, and simply said, "It's time." She smiled apologetically at the other adults. "Looks like I'm running late, as usual. Sorry to run off." Sirius just hugged her again, resting a heavy hand on her head. "Good luck, son." She gulped back a sudden sting in her eyes and closed them in a smile to hide the moisture. "Thanks, Dad." Rigel stepped back and waved more confidently than she felt. Snape set a steady pace and she fell into sync with him automatically. As they stepped through the entrance, the air caught a bit in her chest. The pitch was gone. Only the maze remained. "It's monstrous," she said. "It's nothing but an overgrown garden," Snape said firmly. He gestured to the end of the stadium, where a square stage perched proudly on elegant legs, too elegant to be functional, she thought with a snort. How many stabilizing runes had that required? "That is your aim. The cup in the center of the maze is a portkey to the winner's podium. All of this," he gestured dismissively to the great hedge before them, "is distraction. Keep focused on your goal, and I believe nothing can stop you." Rigel eyed the Roman-style podium fixed to the gazelle-like stage with a grimace. "It's a literal pedestal." "Too late to shy from the limelight now," Snape said, clearly amused at her expense. "There are hats out there with my face on them," she revealed, letting all the disquiet she felt drip into her voice. Snape laughed before he caught himself. He led her to a narrow gap in the hedge. The other champions waited in the shadow of the great maze, both lost in their own thoughts. Snape placed a hand on her shoulder briefly and cleared his throat. "Make us proud," he said quietly. Rigel nodded once, too overcome with emotion to offer more, and Snape left her. She looked around at Owens and Fleur, but neither met her gaze for long. The maze inexorably drew their attention, and she understood why. It bled magic like something radioactive. Waves of the power that went into its creation lapped at her senses, almost numbing in their intensity. Rigel didn't realize she was in its thrall until Bagman was at her shoulder. "Ready, champions." She spun around, shaking her head sharply. The stands were full, roaring noise all around her, and Bagman and Crouch waited like a pair of boatmen on the river Styx. Crouch thrust a headband toward her, and she put it on automatically, hardly noticing the weight of it anymore. "I'm sure you're all chomping at the bit," Bagman said, clapping his hands together as though he, too, were anxious to get into the maze. "A bit of admin first, though." Owens muttered something impolite under his breath, and Bagman pretended not to hear him. "As you know, the champion with the highest running score will enter the maze first. That's you, Mr. Black. Next will be Mr. Owens after 5 minutes have passed, with Miss Delacour entering last at the 10-minute mark." Bagman gave Fleur a patronizing smile. "I'm sure that will be plenty of time, darling, don't you worry. The criteria for winning, and this is very important, Mr. Owens, so please pay attention, well, all you have to do is touch the Triwizard Cup at the center of the maze. It will transport you instantly to the stage below the judge's box, and there you will be crowned the true Triwizard champion. You will be expected to give a winner's speech at the podium, of course, so think of what you want to say while you're wandering around in our little puzzle. Any questions? Are we allowed to hinder one another?" Predictably, it was Owens who voiced the crass query. Bagman raised his eyebrows. "Well, there's no rule against it." Crouch cut in sharply. "Whatever happens in there, just remember you have to live with it out here, young man." Owens shrugged. Fleur glared at him and Rigel vowed to watch her back. "Well, that's all we have for you. Good luck. Mr. Black, please take your starting position." She moved to the mouth of the maze and stared into the darkness. Some cruel soul had fed it a twisting mist that denied the eye more than a dozen feet of visibility. The magic of the maze throbbed at her, and something inside her throbbed back in sympathy. It was all down to one last task. She wasn't consciously aware of the cannon that signaled the start, but her feet moved on their own, and the maze swallowed her whole. -0. LP. -0. She watched her nephew enter the maze with a fearless stride, more worried for Sirius than for him. Their friend had been on edge all year, half convinced that Archie's every goodbye would be his last. He clutched the edge of the balcony tight enough to test the strengthening charms, and Lily breathed a small sigh of relief when James pushed his way into the family box. James was better at calming Sirius than she or Remus. "Sorry, had to placate the minister," James said, dropping a warm kiss onto her cheek. "Has he gone in?" "Just now," Remus said quietly. When James glanced over, he nodded meaningfully toward Sirius, who was staring intently down at the impenetrable hedge maze. James followed his gaze and made a noise of understanding. "The mist will turn transparent once all the champions are in the maze," he revealed. "That way no one can pass information to them beforehand." As he said it, the cannon sounded a third time and the Bosbaton's champion darted into the maze. The great mirrors, suspended above the hedge in a gaudy sort of chandelier, cleared at once to reveal what each champion saw. Simultaneously, the mist that filled the maze shimmered into translucency. Remus looked between the maze itself and the mirrors above it. "The mist is only transparent from above," he mused. "They'll be virtually blind in there." The balcony rail grimaced under Sirius' hands. "Look, there's Archie," James said, pointing left to a small figure near the beginning of the maze. "Not got much sense of direction, has he?" "Gets that from his mum," Sirius murmured, his mouth quirking. His grip relaxed a tad, and Lily sent James a grateful smile. He nodded slightly, soft understanding in his beautiful eyes. They would all be relieved when this tournament was over. Why Archie had insisted on participating, they still didn't fully understand. It was his right, but if he could see what it was doing to Sirius. "Is that a hippogriff?" Remus asked, pointing to a winged creature stalking the far right side of the maze. "And so many spells," Lily said, eyeing the telltale shimmer hanging in the air at several crucial junctures. "Wizards, too," Sirius said. "Friends of yours, James." James winced. "The request came in, and I couldn't very well say no. I also considered the alternative, better trained, responsibler than some duelist for hire or dangerous creature." "You mean like that acromantula?" Sirius jutted his chin toward the scuttling spider almost as tall as the hedge itself and drawled, "Glad we avoided that." James muttered a curse under his breath. "I talked them out of more dragons, at least." "Those aren't all," Remus pointed out. He set a pair of omniculars to his eyes and peered toward a small figure in shining armor. Sirius swiped them and let out a grunt of surprise. "It's that Athenian champion. Antipathy or something." "Antiope," Remus corrected, taking the glasses back. "Did they bring back all the previous champions?" "Just the 3 who excelled in combat," James confirmed. "Antiope and Crumb, and oh, some kind of animal is going for Archie." Sirius grabbed for the omniculars and Remus surrendered them with a sigh of annoyance. "That's not an animal, Sirius, it's an animagus." Sirius hissed as the hyena sprang for Archie's shoulder. "That'll be the 3rd ex-champion," James agreed. "What's happening?" Remus asked. When Sirius didn't answer, utterly engrossed in watching his son's progress, he nudged him with an elbow. "I asked if you wanted your own pair, you." "Here, Remus." Lily passed him her pair of omniculars. "You narrate it for us." Remus adjusted the settings to his preference and put them to his face. "He's doing well, he's fast." "Archie or the hyena?" Lily asked, leaning forward to see Archie's mirror a bit better. It was difficult to get a sense of how his confrontation was going, as the view bobbed and swayed with Archie's every move. "Both," Remus said. Admiration colored his tone. "Archie's got serious reflexes. He's dodging every bite and, whoops, caught a scratch in the elbow, I think." Sirius drew in a sharp breath, glued to his omniculars, and Remus hurriedly added, "Nothing serious, though. He's on the offensive, now." "Good, Archie." He got the other boy with a stinging jinx to the nose. "He's weaving again. Did you know he could move so quick, Sirius?" "Now he's thrown the animagus into the side of the hedge and, yes, he's got him pinned." "Good use of Incarcerus." Sirius let the omniculars fall with a long breath of relief. He dabbed at a bead of sweat on his neck, and James jumped in to distract him. Antiope's found the Delacour girl. At the sound of the French champion's name, a pair of stunningly beautiful heads turned to regard James with affront. Her oblivious husband kept talking, even as Lily pressed a hand to his arm in warning. "I heard she really trounced the poor girl in the semifinals." A woman who could only be Delacour's mother hissed, and a younger silver-haired girl made a tiny claw with her fingers. James froze, his instinct for danger finally alerting him to the very annoyed Partvealer on the other side of the family's box. "It's a different story this time," Remus said, omniculars fixed on the dueling witches. "Delacour must have learned a lot from their last match. Look at her pivot." The hair on the back of James' neck settled as Delacour's family reigned in the strength of their glares. As Remus' commentary turned complimentary, they returned their attention to the task. "Antiope is not letting up. I think there's some bad blood there." "Probably thinks she should have won the half-blood spot," James guessed. "Owens has run into trouble, too," Lily pointed out. The American champion had chosen the middlemost path, but the Durmstrang boy was waiting for him. "I hear Crumb is quite the duelist." "Owens beat him last time," Remus said. "He can do it again." "That's the boy that took Harry's friend, Hermione, to the ball, isn't it?" Lily and Remus turned to stare at James. He held up his hands. "What? I remember things." "It is," Remus confirmed, turning his omniculars toward the pair of boys. "Bad blood there, too. Owens was particularly harsh on Hermione in the semifinals, according to the accounts I've read." "So their past behavior plays a part tonight," James mused. "What about Archie?" Sirius asked suddenly. "Does he have any enemies in there?" Remus shook his head. "By all accounts, he's very well liked, despite having won nearly every task." Sirius grinned. "Course he is. Archie's a good kid." James groaned through his teeth. "Oh no. Not that way, Arch." Sirius whirled back around. "What is it?" "Dawlish." Lily squinted and could just make out the prowling form of James' most trusted lieutenant, lying in wait around the next corner Archie would round. "He won't go full out against a kid," James muttered. She didn't know if he was trying to convince Sirius or himself. Sirius was clenching the railing again, any equanimity he might have gained in the last few minutes erased. "If he hurts Archie, he's just doing his job, Sirius. He won't take it too far." Lily didn't think Sirius even heard the words. Every fiber of his being was tuned toward the pitch, where his son crept closer to the next surprise. -0. HP. -0. She hadn't realized how dependent she'd become on her sensing ability. In the maze, everything was magic. Unlike the comforting ambient magic of the castle, or the neutral backdrop of light and dark creatures of the forest, the maze was a thick, cloying presence. It was barely tamed, semi-sentient magic that had been given one central, lifelike directive: growth. Awash in its power, she was snowblind. At a crossroads, she paused. There were no landmarks in the maze, the mists blotted out the setting sun and every path looked the same. Which way to go? "Point me." The wand spun in her hand endlessly, as confused by all the ambient magic as she was. With a sigh, she went left again. Rigel had no idea how long she'd been in the maze. She'd come across Tariel in his animagus form almost immediately. The scratch on her arm stung as she jogged, and she felt a little better about spraining his ankle to slow him down. It wasn't easy to tie him up without hurting him, and she was in a race. She did think she'd traveled farther than the length of a Quidditch pitch. Some kind of devilishly tricky expansion charms were at work. Even the sound of her own footsteps was muffled by the oppressive mist. As she rounded the next corner, instinct more than insight had her dropping into a slide to avoid the hex that came at chin height. Rigel came out of the roll in a defensive crouch and deflected 2 more spells before she even realized who she was facing. "Professor. Not tonight." Dawlish darted into her comfort zone and she scarcely avoided an elbow to the nose. She countered with a leg sweep and regained space to use her wand in a quick double stunner. Dawlish parried them easily, even seemed to be enjoying himself. She had read the Auror handbook front to back, knew all the moves he was supposed to make, but Dawlish's style had evolved beyond the basic defensive postures taught at the Auror Academy. He was aggressively straightforward, but so fast that the directness was not much of a disadvantage. Rigel sped up her own movements to match his pace, then pushed him a little further, speeding and slowing her spells at random, knowing she only needed that one moment of miscalculation to get under his guard. Dawlish had a good eye for spell speed, though, and he countered every one of her varied spells despite their unpredictability. You've been holding back in class, he accused her. She could take some consolation in the way he panted the words. I've heard this theory before. She took the duel closer in, betting that she could outspar him hand to hand if their wands were out of play. He frustrated her at every turn, somehow maintaining exactly the distance he needed even with hedges hemming them in on either side. When a mad sort of inspiration hit her, she didn't hesitate. Rigel cast a mirrored shield, not around herself, but around Dawlish. She held the magic around him, her wand arm quivering with the strain of it. He barely parried his own rebounded stunner. The Aura stared at her, and she at him through the fractal shield between them. We're at an impasse, he said, gesturing to the shield. I can't cast through it, and you can't drop it to cast at me. She smiled, and brought her left hand up, palm out. The overpowered banishing charm shoved him, shield and all, through the thick hedge at bruising speed. He lay winded in the next aisle, gazing wide-eyed at her through the hole in the hedge. That was for hexing Draco so many times, she called. He wheezed out a dry laugh. It was the only way to get you to respond. The hedge grew together between one breath and the next, and the sound of Dawlish's laughter vanished, as though he had never been there. She took a second to shake out her limbs, then began her slow jog to the next juncture. As she pivoted left and right, debating a direction, she noticed the color of the leaves changing slightly in the wand light. To the right, the hedges were darker. It took weeks to grow these hedges, she thought. New growth is a lighter green. The center of the maze grew first, which means. She went right. Immediately, the magic seemed to press tighter around her, and she knew she'd made the correct choice. It went against every instinct to run toward that feeling instead of away from it, but she put her head down and pressed forward. In the middle of the next aisle, a SPHYNX stirred from her nap, sat on her hind legs, and stared patiently at her. Rigel was tempted to try stunning her straight off, but the gleam in the creature's eyes almost seemed to beg her to try it. Is this a riddle thing? The SPHYNX stretched her wide jaw in a menacing yawn. What can be learned but never taught? Rigel stared at the SPHYNX. Is that all of it? The SPHYNX smiled. Would you like to answer 2 riddles? No. Thank you. Rigel ran a hand through her short hair, wincing when her fingers caught on the plait Pansy had done on one side. What can be learned but never taught? Lots of things, I'd think. Pain, maybe. Or love. These things can be shown by others, and thus taught, the SPHYNX said with a haughty toss of her head. There is but one thing that cannot be demonstrated by another. Rigel blinked. Are you giving me a hint? You seem significantly stupider without your mained companion. Mained, Hermione. Rigel let out a breath. Yeah, she's much better at these. One thing that cannot be demonstrated or taught, like how to make your heart beat. No, that can't really be learned, either. Is it self-confidence? She stared at the SPHYNX. The SPHYNX stared back. I'm going to have to fight you, aren't I? The creature's smile was answer enough. -0. RL. -0. Come on, Archie, it's not that hard, Lily bemoaned. I'd fight it, too, James said with a shrug. Riddles are nonsensical. Remus kept his eyes on Archie, but he could feel the heavy eye roll Lily gave her husband. As the boy began to weave around the SPHYNX's claws, Remus sharpened his omniculars and slowed them down a few notches. Archie's style was unorthodox, but incredibly effective. He never hesitated, seeming as much a creature as the being he fought in the way his instincts guided his reactions. Archie was nowhere near that skilled over the summer. How did he get so good? Remus muttered the words to himself, but James heard him and answered. Training. From who? Remus shook his head. This style is nothing like what is taught at Hogwarts, and they didn't even offer the dueling class this year. Lily's gasp had them focusing on the maze once more, where Archie had caught the SPHYNX in a partial petrification. The creature panted harshly as its legs turned slowly to stone. Archie wiped the sweat from his brow, and began to move on. It's you. The mirror transmitted the SPHYNX's words loud and clear. Archie paused in the frame. What? He asked dully. The truth none can teach you, it's who you are. Archie winced. Oh. I suppose you're right. He walked on. The sound pivoted to Owens, who was caught in some kind of vertigo spell. Rumors tuned it out in favor of asking Sirius, has he mentioned extra training to you? Why are you so fixated on his training? Sirius muttered, avoiding Rumor's gaze. Rumors gestured at Archie's mirror with an impatient hand. Who is that boy up there, Sirius? How could he have changed so much so quickly? Somehow Snape's involved, I just know it. James yelped as Lily slapped his shoulder. Even Severus's style doesn't quite match. How could? He's my son, Sirius snapped. It doesn't matter how he does it, only that he survives it. He outdueled an Rumors growled. There's something not right, Sirius, I know that. Sirius rounded on him, his face so close Rumors could smell the fear on his breath. Lily pulled gently on his arm, and Sirius backed away slightly. I know, Rumors. He's different. I don't know why or how, okay. I don't know my own son anymore. He whispered the last, his expression harshly bracketed in pain. Rumors regretted upsetting Sirius further, but he knew in his gut something was wrong. You don't think he'd? He couldn't finish the question. Sirius sneered. Pay someone else to do the tournament for him. Rumors winced at the way it sounded, but Sirius merely shook his head. No, I would, but Archie is better than me. Anyway, he added under his breath, turning back toward the maze. It's been longer than an hour. It had been, at that. -0. HP. -0. Rigel could swear the hedge was growing more restless as she neared the center. She wondered if it was annoyed at her. She had blown a Professor Dawlish-sized hole through one of its appendages. Don't personify the hedge, she told herself sharply. It rustled in an invisible wind, banishing all other sound until the only thing she could hear was the rushing of leaves. She gritted her teeth against the sound current and pressed on. The hedge fairly screamed at her as she turned the next corner. It felt like running into a headwind of pure magic. She had to be close. The mists parted like a veil just a few steps from the junction, and the rest of the corridor was revealed in sudden, sharp relief. The cup stood in the center, gleaming with an active Portkeys telltale glow, and on the far side, Fleur. The silver-haired girl slumped slightly, a slash through her shoulder that was bleeding profusely. Rigel tensed the muscles in her legs and took a deep breath. They'd have to race for it. Her toes dug into the grass as she shot forward in an all-out sprint. Fleur was running, too. Was it slower than she'd seen the girl run before? She couldn't be sure. She pumped her legs on sheer willpower, eating up the ground between herself and the cup. Her fast twitch muscles protested, but she was past feeling the pain. They came within 15 feet of the cup. 10 feet, 8, and the hedge erupted around them. Vines snaked out, tripped both of them, and Rigel went down hard as she grappled with the cantankerous bush. It dragged her across the ground, up, then back down, and she fought the nauseating vertigo as she struggled to right herself against the maze's will. She flared her magic violently, but there was something resistant in the plant's makeup. The bloody thing was imbued with more magic than made any sense, and raw power alone wasn't. A spell, white-hot and sizzling, sliced through the hedge cleanly. The bulk of what had attached itself to Rigel fell away, and she dropped to the ground on a rough roll. She came out of it in a backward scramble and saw Fleur still trapped in the hedge 10 feet away. In an instant, she knew what had happened. The other girl didn't meet her eyes, appeared to still be struggling with the hedge herself, but who else could it have been? Fleur had deferred. Rigel took the chance the other girl had bought her. She wrapped a shield around herself and dug for the cup. Vines grasped for purchase and failed. 5 steps. 2. She put her wand back in its holster, and palmed the disc the twins had slipped her for the grand finale in her left hand. 1 step. It was over. Her right hand closed on the handle and the world tilted sideways. On its axis. -0. TRTRTR. -0. Finally. With a stumbling gasp, all of his plans fell into place. The boy won. He would never admit to nerves, but it had been grating to watch the Delacour chit come so close. The boy had an unnatural luck, her spell misfired and released Rigel instead. He took the chance, naturally, Slytherin that he was. The great mirror shone white as the portkey activated. He allowed himself a smile as the minister stood to officiate the crowning. The boy reappeared on the stage, disheveled but whole and unquestionably. Magic lashed out from the four corners of the stage. Tom reared to his feet, wand in hand, Dumbledore a moment behind. "Tom, what have you?" he hissed at the old fool. "Not me." 5 figures illusioned themselves on the platform. One at each corner, wardcasters. "Barty," he cursed, eyes drawn to the blithering imbecile at the northern corner. He sharpened his magical sight, and now he could see the runes, hidden cleverly among innocuous strengthening arrays, bleeding to life across the structure. He cast at the wards before anyone could react. His spell resounded against them with a thundering crack, but the winner's platform was left untouched. The 5th figure, standing in the center of the stage near their bewildered champion, threw back his hood and glared up at Tom defiantly, as though he was meant to recognize him. A vampire, that much was obvious. He had never crossed the covens. Whosoever had the gall to interrupt his tournament was going to regret crossing him, however. Dumbledore let loose an outlandish display of magic that poured over the wards like an undammed river. Those near them in the box backed away from the force of it, but Tom stood his ground a pace away. The old man strained visibly before coming to the conclusion Tom had reached already. As he pulled back his magic, for once looking all his 100-some years, Dumbledore spoke the terrible realization aloud. "They've anchored to Hogwarts. -0. HP. -0. Bloody. Damn. Wards." Rigel's magic lashed out in terrified fury. She would not be trapped again. It didn't make it far from her skin. A vacuum opened up, like a gaping tear in the world, and sucked the magic away from her grasp. Rigel pushed herself up on shaking hands, eyes darting about the platform. Where did it go? She let a smaller amount of magic loose, and this time followed it carefully. It traveled less than a foot before being swept up in some kind of current, like metal shavings to a magnet. The invisible current carried it to the gaudy Roman pedestal, stage center left. The podium was a magical magnet. Powerful, isn't it? That voice. Like dust on a stone step. She looked up and stared as Gavril threw back his hood and raised his sharp chin toward the judge's box. Magic slapped the side of the ward in a dull roar, and Rigel belatedly realized, this was not part of the task at all. "Gavril. What are you?" Her voice echoed strangely all around her, and she realized her headband was still transmitting. She stopped speaking when a sinister smile, the likes of which she had never seen on the lieutenant, crawled over his face. She forced her exhausted legs to stand and turned in a slow circle. Barty Jr. was behind her at the nearest corner of the platform. A woman she didn't recognize stood at another, a masked man she knew as Scar, and she blinked. Jordan. Lee Jordan sneered at her from across the square stage, but Gavril drew her attention as he took a menacing step toward her. "So you recognize my host," the vampire chuckled, a mirthless, creaking sound. "Small world. I wonder if you'll be so quick to recognize me." Host. Something that had been lurking in the back of her mind, a fear that she had never put fully to bed, rose up from its tangle of sheets with a strangled cry. Voldemort. She dropped her wand into her hand and struck out with the laser-sharp point of a piercing spell. It flew like an arrow, until it curved back and fizzled against the podium's runes. A magical attractant Gavril, Voldemort, dropped the words almost idly. "Well worth what it cost to procure, judging by the magic you're throwing around, someone's grown into their core, HM." He gestured to the other 4, all of whom knelt in obsequious patience, waiting for something. "When they brought me tales of how powerful you'd become, I was dismissive, but then, I underestimated you once before, didn't I? What are you trying to achieve, Voldemort? This stadium is surrounded. Aurors, Hogwarts professors, not to mention Dumbledore and Riddle." She spat the last name in his face and watched it twist with a vicious sense of satisfaction. "Do you think any of them will let you get away? Do not speak my name." He took another step toward her. They were almost within arm's length. You shouldn't share a name you don't want people to use, she hissed. His face contorted with fury, and she used the moment of distraction to strike, slamming her foot into his knee, or where his knee should have been. A fist like a stone that she never saw coming smashed into the side of her head, and Rigel hit the deck hard. Through the ringing in her ears, she could just make out the sound of Gavril's stolen laugh. "Vampire, kid," Dom whispered in her ear. "Right." Rigel sent magic to her wounded head and breathed a small sigh of relief when it wasn't sucked away by the magical attractant. The magic within her skin seemed to be safe. She could heal herself, at least. Dom helped her focus through the dizziness to stem the internal bleeding, and as her eardrums repaired themselves, she heard the battering ram of concussive magic pounding away at the platform wards in successive blows. The Auras were working in tandem, and others would be helping, her family, her teachers. The wards couldn't withstand that forever. She just had to stall. Rigel pushed herself up on 2 hands and knees and spat a glob of blood into her sleeve. "You must be very weak." Voldemort whirled to glare at her, the movements unnaturally graceful in the vampiric form he possessed. "I could crush you with 2 fingers, boy." "Physically, sure," she bit out, forcing a laugh. "Like a muggle. You're magically weak, though, aren't you? That's why you need help from a school dropout, an alley thug, a greedy politician's son, and, I assume, a lady with poor taste in friends." The red-headed woman bared yellow teeth at her, but Voldemort bent close enough to block out the others and hissed, "I have magic enough to come back from the grave, boy. Magic enough to survive 4 years as mere shadow and vapor. Magic enough to possess the darkest of creatures. With some help from Jordan's neurotoxins, right?" Rigel sneered. "Face it. Without these wards, you'd already be finished. There are hundreds of wizards out there more powerful than you." "But not more powerful than you," Voldemort said lowly. He appeared behind her faster than her eyes could track. Her magic was whisked away as quickly as it left her skin. Her arms were wrenched behind her back and her wand torn from her hand with enough force to break 2 of her fingers. She cried out, enraged to see it taken, and Voldemort laughed into her ear. "Whoops. Don't know my own strength." Each of her arms was secured to the podium, and she could feel the greedy magnet at her back suckling the stray edges of her magic. She wrapped it tightly inside herself and clamped down. It was trapped, as surely as she was, but not forever. Voldemort stepped back to inspect his handiwork and twirled her wand in long, pale fingers. He frowned down at the tool, turning it over and over in his hands. "This wand. It calls to me." As well it might, it was his original wand's brother. He tried to cast with it, but the holy wand's tip barely sparked. She thought he must have forgotten what happened when he tried to use her wand while possessing Ginny. With a moue of disappointment, he pocketed it. "Magic is beyond me in this form," he admitted. His eyes locked with hers, and she noticed they were a deep, glowing red. Not for much longer, though. She struggled instinctively against the bonds, every part of her rebelling against the thought of it. "I won't let you possess me," she growled. "Tried that already." He shrugged, strangely nonchalant. "I do believe you'd die first. I don't need your body, however. Only your magic." He snapped his fingers, and Lee Jordan approached from the far corner of the stage. He cradled a stone-grey device like a turnip in his hands, runes of darkest amethyst shining along it in twisting ribbons. "I asked to be here," he said as he stopped in the middle. "I want to look into your eyes when the magic drains out of you." Rigel stared at him. "You shame your house, Lee Jordan." His handsome face contorted. "You. Enough." Voldemort took the device from the boy and waved him back. When the center of the platform was clear, he took the device by the stem and spun it like a top. It whirled across the stage, spitting runes out in patterns much faster than anyone could have drawn them. Hundreds of runes were laid in the space of a minute. It was a marvel, and it told her one thing: he was conscious of the time, too. He knew the wards wouldn't last forever. Scar stepped forward next. As he walked, he peeled an illusion away from a great cauldron at the back of the stage. Rigel goggled at it. It was the largest she'd ever seen. Scar hefted it carefully toward the center of the runic array. Smoke like dry ice drifted over its surface in cirrus clouds. She didn't recognize the brew, but it was certainly in the advanced stage. coupled with a runic array large enough to fill half the platform. She didn't know what they had planned, but it wasn't casual magic. Rigel steeled herself for the worst. -0. LMLMLM. -0. Lucius tried to follow the rapid argument unfolding beside him, but it was difficult to tear his eyes from the platform where Rigel Black was being held hostage. Narcissa trembled against him in impotent fury, and he felt much the same. They've anchored that ward to Hogwarts herself, Minister. What part of that don't you comprehend? Lucius winced. It was not like his lord to be so blunt with the minister, but then, time was wasting. To get through it, we must dismantle the entire ward system around the school, Dumbledore told him. There is no other way. Fudge spluttered. Those wards have stood since the founders. A child is in danger, Cornelius. Madam Marchbanks spoke sharply. But we don't even know what's going on yet. To tear down the founders' wards just like that. There is no discussion of if, Lord Riddle cut in, stark finality in his tone. Only how. Dumbledore inclined his head. Well said, Tom. I will go to the Lodestone and begin the unweaving. Begin the what? A flash of fire and heat prompted a flinch Lucius would deny to his dying breath. When he opened his eyes, Dumbledore was gone. Bloody Phoenix, Golden Tower muttered, wiping soot from his face. What on Merlin's green earth? Narcissa gripped his forearm hard enough to draw blood beneath his coat. Lucius turned back to the platform, where an array as large as the main foyer in his mansion had appeared out of nowhere. How? He clamped his mouth shut before he could embarrass himself further. Turning to Lord Riddle, he said, is there anything we can do? The most powerful man Lucius knew clenched his fist helplessly and stared down at the unfolding drama. Until he unravels the anchors, I can do nothing. Lucius held his wife close, and thanked every ghost in his family tree that his son had not been selected for the tournament after all. I hate this, Lucius, Narcissa whispered for his ears alone. Rigel is strong. Believe in him. The vampire, Voldemort, Rigel kept calling him, and what kind of French demon was that, drew something small from his robes. A pair of vials, they could see through Rigel's mirror. Filled with blood. Something sunk in Lucius' chest. Blood magic was never good. Recognize this, clever boy. It's yours. The creature tipped a vial over the input array, and the runes captured its contents in floating stasis. The empty vial was tossed aside, and the vampire sneered down at Rigel. No use taking it now, when it will be so much more potent willingly given. Barty, Lord Riddle snarled. Lucius frowned, trying to follow the logic of his rage, and Narcissa whispered, the fifth task. Of course. The final ward had required a blood sacrifice. But that meant. They meant him to win. Golden Tower said it slowly, somewhat disbelieving. Someone planned it months in advance, and designed the tasks to culminate in this moment. The man turned a weighty gaze on Lord Riddle, who drew himself to full height as his nostrils flared. Be careful whom you paint with accusations. Barty is a traitor and will be dealt with accordingly. By which you mean a fair trial and equitable sentence, Golden Tower drawled, sarcastic disgust in every syllable. The second vial, Marchbanks said suddenly. She looked to Golden Tower and they communicated something silently. You don't think? They didn't have to wonder long. Rigel shook with anger as his captor upended the second vial onto the runes. Your cousins. Rigel bucked wildly against the restraints. If you've touched a hair on Harry's head, I'll. Your blood cousin, fool. Tonks. The horrified whisper echoed throughout the stadium as Rigel slumped against the podium. She squealed like a pig when we cut her throat. Narcissa went limp beside him. And his child. She moaned. She's alive. Golden Tower said it confidently, leaving no room for doubt. Rigel healed her in time. Silence. Riddle was fixated on the platform below, listening hard. The ritual is stronger with blood from a living family member, to give consent, so to speak. Voldemort said it slowly, mockingly. Every word was designed to hurt. It'll anchor on your shared gift, and tear that from you, too. The red-headed woman stepped forward. Lucius didn't recognize her, didn't recognize any of the interlopers apart from Crouch's misbegotten son, but she had the ragged look of a person who spent too much of their lives in drudgery. She held a weathered tome in both hands, and when she spoke, it was with the old tongue. The box was silent as they absorbed the words. Lucius had to till the frozen fields of his youth to recall their significance, but at last, it came to him. "It's an ancient magical transference ritual," Lucius murmured, in case his lord didn't recognize it. Lord Riddle tilted his head slightly to indicate he was listening. "Its use is strongly discouraged. It will convey a pureblood's magic to a lesser vessel, but was only intended for times of true peril to a family line." The gift he speaks of. It was not a question, but Lucius supplied the answer anyway. "The boy's metamorphism, his cousin shares it." At Riddle's sharp look, he elaborated. "A passive give, as I understand it, and not much under the boy's control. He may be hoping the ritual will amplify it." Sharp gasps sounded throughout the box as the cauldron on the platform boiled over in ash-gray smoke. The vampire stepped toward the cauldron, anticipation lighting his ancient features. "You don't want to do this," Rigel pleaded with the creature, and Lucius' heart burned for him. A scion as powerful and talented as Rigel Black, stripped of his magic before his prime. It was unthinkable. But the ritual was immutable. If Dumbledore didn't work quickly, it would be too late. Squibhood, or worse. The thing stalking the platform only laughed. It stepped into the cauldron, and its laugh turned to a shriek that slowly choked itself into silence. The stadium held its breath as runes all across the array lit up in a blaze of power. The four humans bent to the edges of the circle and added their own power to it. Something writhed in the cauldron, obscured by the ashy mist. Rigel screamed. He writhed and panted against his bonds, and Lucius had to master his stomach before he could sharpen his sight and look as the ritual sunk its hooks into the child, or tried to. The connection between the cauldron and Rigel was warped, somehow. "Something is awry," he breathed. The figure in the cauldron stumbled out into a haze of magic that roiled in the air, seeking but denied an outlet. Rigel screamed again, and it was echoed by the other figures on the platform as magic unfettered burst in an uncontrolled wave from the array. Rigel was pressed to the podium as the others fell to the deck, and the magic was so thick Lucius could see the attractant attempting to pull it all into its powerful ensnarement. The creature in the center fought through the storm of magic. "What have you done?" The smoke from the cauldron cleared, and Lucius sucked in a breath as the figure was revealed, no longer a vampire, but a boy of perhaps 17. He turned in slow horror to regard his lord, whose features differed from the creature on the stage only in maturity. Their fury was perfectly matched. A warning squeeze from Narcissa pulled his attention back to Rigel. The boy watched the newly risen creature approach, his eyes narrowed against the intensity of the magical winds. The thing that looked so much like a young Riddle wrapped its hands around Rigel's neck and squeezed. Lucius braced himself, but Rigel didn't appear to be suffocating. "His vampiric strength is gone," he heard Golden Tower say. "What did you do?" In the mirror, they could see the hard lines of wrath and fear in the creature's face. Rigel's thin voice echoed through the stadium almost softly. "You fucked up. The ritual won't work." The creature turned on one of his own disciples with a howl. "Jordan, fix this." The dark-skinned boy held up his hands in supplication. "The runes are correct, Master. It's the boy, or the blood. The S signatures aren't compatible." When it seemed as though the creature would strike his follower, Rigel laughed. It was a coarse, bruised sound, but there was unmistakable humor running through it like a thread of steel. "Bad idea to use a signature-sensitive ritual. So delicate, aren't they?" The creature took up Rigel's wand and attempted to cast with it. When it failed, he tossed the tool aside in utter fury. "Whose blood was that?" Rigel gave a pained grin. "Not mine." Narcissa gasped. Lucius bit his lip to keep from doing the same. Marchbanks was unable to contain herself. He used someone else's blood in the fifth task. How could he have anticipated? "Draco calls him paranoid," Narcissa murmured. "Perhaps it has saved him." Lucius held her hand tightly. "No." Riddle said the word with bleak certainty, even as the creature below snarled. "Take his blood. We will salvage it." Barty Jr. advanced on Rigel with his wand outstretched. "It won't be as strong," unwilling Lucius said, quietly desperate. "He may only get a portion." Narcissa averted her eyes as Barty Jr. cut one of Rigel's arms free to bleed it. There was a blur of motion, and Barty stumbled back, clutching his stomach where a dark stain spread quickly. The creature let out a cry of anger and bodily hauled the stuck man out of the circle before he could bleed on the runes. Rigel held a knife in the hand that had been freed, and blood dripped from its blade to the decking. "Here's your blood," Rigel panted, flicking the tip of the knife toward the array. The masked man moved quickly, and his magic caught the drops just before they touched the circle. Lucius loosed a frustrated growl. So close, he almost ruined it. At Narcissa's questioning look, he said quietly, "The ritual can take one mistake, but two." He shook his head. The boy was brilliant. It really would be such a loss. The woman kicked the knife from Rigel's fingers, and the Jordan boy punched Rigel across the mouth. His head snapped back into the podium, and blood spluttered from his mouth as he coughed to keep from choking on it. The dark-skinned boy wiped his fingers through the red liquid dribbling down Rigel's chin and smiled. He bent and smeared it on the runic array. Lucius braced himself as the magic snapped into a controlled whirlwind on the platform. With his sight, he watched the connection re-establish itself, and sputter into nothing. "It isn't working." The words felt wandering on his lips. A spark of hope flickered in his breast, and quailed as Lord Riddle erupted into furious parcel tongue. Lucius looked back at the boy with a lurch in his stomach, but no, it really wasn't working. And wasn't that a good thing? But then, why did Riddle look more furious than ever? Jordan cowered on the platform as the creature laid its wrath on him for a second time. "Master, please, the bee blood, it isn't compatible. Look at the runes. You just took it from him. It's not pure." Lucius felt his blood freeze. He couldn't mean. The creature on the platform turned slowly back to Rigel, who stood against the podium with his head held high, trembling and defiant, and not at all confused. -0. HP. -0. It was almost funny. Watching their faces contort. Watching their plans fall to pieces. How arrogant to use a ritual so specific, she muttered. She felt a little apathetic, watching him scream uselessly at her in his little boy body. The blood of the family member should match the blood given. The magical signature in the blood given should match the magic being transferred. And most importantly, it's an unequal transfer. She rested her head against the podium, which still pulsed with magic behind her, bloated on all it had absorbed. Pure blood to half-blood, I believe it was intended. Maybe it could be wrangled to work half-blood to Muggleborn. But half-blood to half-blood. She closed her eyes and shook her head with a wry smile. Absolutely not. The magic roared around them, twisted and shuddering as the ritual tried and failed to contain and channel it. Voldemort screamed over top of it, his voice echoing through her headband to every corner of the stadium. "You are not Archerus Black. Who are you?" It was almost funny. The question she woke with every morning. The question she went to bed with every night. She was so close to breaking free. Her untethered hand, unwisely cut free, was working on the ropes, but it was clumsy with newly healed fingers. Her other hand still clutched what she'd portkid onto the platform with, what seems like hours ago. There were still the wards to deal with, but she'd had time now to study them. Blaise had already shown her what to do, and she would think about why her friend's wards had been erected by Riddle's evil construct later. First, she had to get rid of the magical attractant. Free magic wouldn't work. Magic had to be bound by runes to get far from her skin. Voldemort was bent double against the press of a magical storm of his own making. He wasn't nearly so strong now that he'd abandoned Gavril's body. The vampire lay crumpled beside the cauldron, and she spared a hope that there was something left of him when this was all over. "I will tear the truth from your mind, imposter." The only power remaining to him, she thought tiredly. There was no question whether she was strong enough to fight off a Legilimency attack. She wasn't. Cold hands gripped her neck once more and she felt his entry like a blade to her brain, like nails raking her very soul. Rigel thrashed, trying to use the pain as an anchor, to stay awake and fight. She was so close to finishing. The imbuing was, almost, there. The violence of his intrusion slammed her into unconsciousness. -0. DJ DJ DJ. -0. The enemy came boldly, foolishly. He tore through the snowstorm, leaving scars on the girl's mindscape that would take time and magic to heal. Dom met him at the foot of the mountain with a forbidding scowl. "No vacancy, mate." The curiously constructed bit of magic paused, looked him over, and sneered. "I won't be fooled twice by that puppet." The fragile ego encased in magic attempted to move past him, and Dom pulled the mindscape out from under him. Ah! The enemy construct slammed into a wall and reared back, finding itself suddenly in a crumbling tomb. It took a step back and fell off the top of the mountain. Before it could reorient itself, it slammed into the side of a pyramid and bam, into one of the tunnels beneath the mountain and splash, into the Nile. It came up wet and spluttering and found itself buried to the neck in the burning sand. A SPHYNX rested her taloned paw on the enemy's head, and Dom bent down to talk to the head in his most reasonable tone. "You like magic so much? Here's a little on the house." He shuddered as the magic clawed its way up from his belly. With a great heave, he spat the little ball of foreign magic onto the construct's sand-crusted head. It caught fire, and smoldered as the enemy construct screamed. "The resonance burns a bit, doesn't it?" Dom stood and stretched his arms. "Now, about your presence in this realm." He hauled the construct up by the neck and stared into its soulless eyes. For a single, frozen moment, he let the sentient ball of angst see the endless depths of his existence. He revealed the ages of silence, the terrible question without an answer, the unending, unraveled, aloneness. Then he whispered. "The position of magical advisor has been filled." No longer wary of mingling her magic with the vile stuff in his belly, Dom drew on the golden sun and banished the construct through the mists. "The rest is up to you, kid. Wake up." -0. HP. -0. Rigel came to with a gasp. The podium dug into her back, but the knots were loose. She ripped at them with a grunt of effort, trying to get enough slack to slip them from her other arm. Blood rushed back into her limbs with a vengeance, but she dulled the pain automatically, her magic circulating inside her like a caged lioness. Voldemort was seizing on the platform, the whites of his eyes showing. His minions hovered over him uncertainly. Scar waved his wand intently above the convulsing chest. "The resonance," Dom whispered with an ominous laugh. "It's just different enough from his warped signature to be extremely unpleasant." This was her only chance. She gave up on the bonds and focused on the tiny disc clenched in her left hand. She'd imbued it to the hilt, pumping magic straight from her palm too fast for the podium to steal. Rigel shoved just a little more magic into it. The runes started to heat uncomfortably against her skin. Voldemort began to rouse. The only words he choked out were, "Kill him. Kill him." Barty was still slumped and bleeding, but Jordan started toward her. A device glinted in his hands. It looked sharp. "The world can watch what happens to filth when it reaches too high," he crooned. "This is going to hurt," Rigel acknowledged. When he was within reach, she slammed her forehead into his. The crack of his skull against the headband sounded like a thunderclap in the stadium. Her knee came up to meet his crotch, her free arm grabbed the device from his limp hands, and she used the sharp end to cut the remainder of her bonds in one precise slice. She dropped the disc and dove. The pedestal latched onto the artifact that pulsed to the brim with power. It was pulled into the stone. And exploded. Rigel threw up a shield at her back and knew the magical attractant had been destroyed when it held. She heard Jordan scream as the shards of the podium found him unprepared. Cracks and booms and unintelligible light filled the platform as dozens of overpowered fireworks went off all at once, right on top of one another. She couldn't hear anything but static, couldn't see beyond an impression of overwhelming light and force, but then, one color cut through all the rest. A beam of green light, coming right for her. Miscalculation, was all she could think as the killing curse washed out the world. Heat in her chest, and she wondered, was this death? This light, so bright and unending, this warmth, like a searing sun setting in her heart. She took a breath. 2 breaths. The light receded enough to identify the source, her necklace. Her mother's amulet was glowing. It was the burning in her chest. It had stopped the unstoppable curse. The fireworks crackled out. Scar stared at his wand and everyone else stared at her. She clung to the heartbeat in her veins and the air in her breath. Everything else could be wondered at later. Rigel unleashed her magic at last. It blew the others back like a jet stream, clearing the way to the nearest corner of the wards. Only one person was necessary to take it down from the inside. Rigel took the steps almost serenely. She reached out to the anchoring runes and ripped. The wards resisted, like stakes frozen into the ground, but Rigel's will was stronger than the pull of whatever ley line they were tied into. With a groan, the wards rippled and strained, but they gave way. A strange sort of vindictive pleasure rose in her as the wards shattered into 1,000 shards of magic. The trapped little girl who had to be saved last year had broken the cage herself this time. The roar of the crowd slammed into her. She could see everything clearer, now. The people in the stands, the minister gaping just above her from his box. Riddle looked ready to flay her alive, and the Malfoys, they didn't seem to recognize her at all. Aurors rushed the stage. Scar saw them coming, looked at the injured Barty and Jordan, and apparated away with the convulsing construct in his arms. The red-headed woman was a beat behind him. The anti-apparition wards were down. It took her a moment to realize what that meant. Aurors started toward her, but an explosion outside the stadium turned every head but one. In a sort of trance, she saw Sirius coming across the platform toward her. His hands were blooded, as though he'd beat them against the wards. She reached up with numb fingers and pulled the transmitter off her head. She tossed it to the platform floor and summoned her wand, which lay abandoned on the other side of the stage. Sirius's face was so close she could see the exact moment it crumpled in disbelief. She turned on the spot, and felt the whoosh of displaced air as his fingers almost caught her. She didn't go far. -0. DM. -0. All around him, people shouted. They'd been shouting and panicking ever since Rigel touched that cup. Draco held Pansy's hand, because he didn't know what else to do. His first instinct, when they realized something was wrong, had been to find his parents, but what could they do that Dumbledore and Riddle weren't already trying? He had to believe that Rigel would get out of it, he always had before. And then, without any warning, Rigel wasn't Rigel. Or he was, but something really messed up was going on. A man shot the killing curse at him, and he had never heard Pansy scream like that before. He never wanted to hear it again. Nothing made any sense after that. Rigel wasn't dead. Rigel tore down what seemed to be every ward for miles, and suddenly people were shouting about the stands being unstable. And they were shouting other things that he didn't want to hear. Are they going to arrest him? How is he not dead? He's some kind of undead. He's a monster. Draco was barely holding it together under the absolute tsunami of emotions rioting around him. His friends weren't helping in the slightest. Blaze was pale, his lips white as he pressed them together against whatever words wanted to come out. Why did he run? Millicent moaned. Rigel, you idiot, you never run. Course he ran, Theo snarled. Millie, you saw the ritual fail. If he stays here, it'll be just like green grass. Worse, even. You could tell he knew it. Shut up, Draco snapped. We don't know anything yet. You can't be that stupid. Be quiet, Theodore. Pansy jumped into the argument with vehemence. You cannot possibly presume to know circumstances. Draco tuned them out. He couldn't think. He pushed his way through the stands, not caring who he elbowed on his way to the stairs. As he rounded the first landing, he saw Sirius Black, kneeling with his head bowed on the winner's platform. A green headband clutched in his fingers. He shook his head to erase the image. Not my problem. I've got to find Rigel. Rigel. Where would Rigel go? He slipped out of the chaos of the stadium, running as fast as he could back toward the castle. He passed a team of Aurors with tracking crops fanning out across the grounds. Young apparatus can't go very far, search the forest. Draco cursed his own laziness for not learning to apparate over the summer like his father suggested. Still, he hadn't trained all those mornings for nothing. His legs soared over the flagstones of the entrance hall. He pounded down the stairs and flew through the dungeon corridors on wings of desperation. The world had gone crazy. Rigel was a dizzying mess of contradictions, but a few fundamental truths wouldn't shift, no matter what else had. He'd never leave without his potions kit. -0. HP. -0. She collapsed on her bed, the breath coming in short gasps between her ribs. For one keening moment she wanted to cry. There was no time. She pointed her wand at the door and locked it with the strongest charm she knew. Her eyes traced the room. First, the bed. Slipping to the floor, she vanished her blankets, bed sheets, and pillows. The mirror went into her pocket. The trunk was next. She slammed open the lid and rifled through it, deciding moment to moment what to vanish and what to take. The uniforms she wore, Archie's underclothes and socks, all vanished. No item of clothing survived, save for her father's cloak. With a mental apology, she vanished the shoes Draco had occasionally lent her. She tore through the rest of the room. Her toiletries were removed from the bathroom, her towel, even the rug had to go. Anything she'd touched or might have shed essence on. Her school bag was the last. Emptied of papers, notes, and books. All of it vanished along with every letter she'd ever kept, all but the map. She swung the potions kit over her shoulder. The door slammed open. She whirled, and caught Draco in the doorway, the knife Sirius had once given him shaking in his hand. His eyes took in the room, the missing objects, and he shook his head slowly. Rigel, what are you doing? I don't have time to explain right now, Draco. I have to go. No. You should stay. I can't. She pleaded with her eyes, begged him to understand. He took a step toward her, empty hand outstretched. You've been through hell just now, right? Everyone will understand you panicked, but don't make it worse. Just come with me and explain. I can't explain. Everything will be like it was, he said. She shook her head helplessly. I can't, they all heard. That psychopath doesn't know anything about you, Draco said firmly. We'll prove you're who you are. Here, he held out the dagger, hilt toward her. Take it. It will prove you're a black. We can prove it to them. She heard the words he wasn't saying. Please, prove it to me. She wanted to. She wanted to take all the doubt and confusion in his eyes and vanish it like everything else she'd touched. She held her hand out and moved it slowly toward the dagger. Perhaps she could overpower the recognition spell. Trick the mechanics, somehow. Before she'd even touched it, the hilt turned an angry red and Draco hissed as it burned his fingers. She closed her fist and felt her heart solidify. I can't. Because it's true. No. He dropped the dagger to the carpet and shook his head angrily. What does an old knife know? Draco. She caught his gaze and held it. It's true. I don't understand. Are you a bastard? She shook her head. I'm not related to the blacks at all. I'm not a pure blood, I'm not even English. Draco flinched. Did Rigel get you to do the tournament for him? Her face pinched and her eyes burned. No. I've always been here. I'm just not, I wanted, she blew out a shaky breath. It doesn't matter what I wanted. I have to leave, now, Draco. I'm sorry. No, Rigel. We'll figure something out. Don't you get it, she snapped. He stared at her, and she said it as clearly and slowly as she could. That's not even my name. Understanding, cold and unforgiving, began to dawn at last in his eyes. She swept the room one last time, making certain she hadn't forgotten anything incriminating. When she turned back to her friend, he looked at her, lost. She had set him utterly adrift. There was nothing she could do about it. You won't look for me, she said, building ice in careful layers with her words. I can't just forget everything. You won't look for me, because I'm calling in your life debt. Draco's face went white. You can't. I, who saved you from the sleeping sickness, do hereby claim the debt of life you owe me. Her voice didn't shake, didn't crack like her insides were cracking. You and your family, having taken on the debt in kind, shall not look for the boy you know as Rigel Black. You shall not seek news of him, search for signs of him, or participate in hunting for him at the direction of another. Through this, your debt is discharged. So mote it be. Light flared between them, and Draco clutched at his heart. She wondered if a weight had settled there as surely as it had nested in her breast. How could you, he whispered. Rigel. There is no Rigel. There was, though. We were friends. She shook her head, and pushed him a little closer to hate. That was just an elaborate lie, Draco Malfoy. Rigel Black isn't real. And I don't have any friends. A clean break, she thought, her own heart breaking. She turned on the spot, and was gone before his knees hit the floor. The tears made the journey with her, but didn't fall until she reappeared in the shadow of the clock tower. She knew she had to gather her strength, had to apparate a few more times to get safely away, but her mind couldn't focus past the look of betrayal on Draco's face. She vomited into the bushes, vanished it shakily with a jerk of her wand, and sobbed into her fist until she could breathe again. Before she was ready for the next jump, she felt anti-apparition spells spring like a trap over the school. They'd begun reweaving the wards already. She pulled out the map with shaking hands and processed the dotted lines of strangers in every direction. They'd set up a perimeter. She had to get out. Her mind raced through options, each more outlandish than the last. She could don the cloak and try to sneak past highly alert Aurors who were on the lookout for someone sneaking around. She could fight the Aurors, and hope she got away before someone she couldn't overpower arrived. She could hide in the room of requirement. She could brew polyjuice, and when a month had gone by and the search had died down, she could take the form of someone else and just walk out. Only she didn't have a month to lose hiding.